The woman didn't even have the decency to whisper it. She said it right there on the main street of Dodge City, loud enough that two men loading feed sacks outside the general store turned to look. Her name was Clara Hofstede, and she ran the largest boarding house on 2nd Avenue. And she had just finished reading Maggie Whitmore's application for the position of kitchen manager, with the expression of someone who had found a dead mouse inside a flour barrel. "I'm sorry," Clara said, though her voice carried no apology in it whatsoever. "But I have a reputation to maintain. My guests expect a certain standard of presentation from everyone they encounter under my roof." She folded the application once, twice, set it on the counter between them. "You understand." Maggie understood perfectly. She picked up the folded paper. She thanked Clara Hofstede for her time. She walked out of that boarding house with her back straight and her jaw set, and didn't let herself breathe until she reached the corner, where she leaned against the hitching post and stared at the dirt street and thought, with cold and terrible clarity, "I am 27 years old and I have nowhere left to go." Before you see what happens next, if this kind of story speaks to something in you, if you've ever had to prove yourself to people who had already decided you weren't worth their time, please take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from, because I want to know how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Kansas, because Maggie Whitmore is about to walk through a door that will change the rest of her life. The advertisement was small. It sat in the lower right corner of the Dodge City Standard, surrounded by notices about land sales and missing livestock, and it read with the bluntness of a man who had no patience for elaborate language. "Cook wanted, room and board provided. Must be good with children. Inquire at Rourke Ranch, 14 miles south of Dodge on the Cimarron Road. Ask for E. Rourke." Maggie read it twice on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1883, sitting at the table of her rented room, a room she had exactly 9 more days to pay for before Mrs. Garland, her current landlady, would begin asking uncomfortable questions. She read it a third time. Then she folded the newspaper carefully, set it on the bed beside her worn carpet bag, and started packing. She did not let herself think too hard about it. Thinking too hard had a way of talking her out of things, and she had already been talked out of too many things by too many people who had formed their opinions of her before she ever opened her mouth. The road south out of Dodge City was dusty and long, and the wagon driver who gave her a ride, a weathered man named Birch who was delivering fence posts, didn't say much beyond a mumbled greeting when she climbed up beside him. That suited Maggie fine. She watched the flat Kansas land stretch out around them, the sky enormous above it, the autumn grass gone the color of dried wheat, and she allowed herself exactly one moment of honest reckoning. She had grown up large. She had been large as a child and larger as a young woman, and she had long since understood that the world was not built for women who looked like her, not the social world. Anyway, not the world of parlors and Sunday dresses, and the kind of respectability that required a woman to be decorative before anything else. Her mother had been a practical woman who raised Maggie to cook and clean and manage a household with the focused efficiency of someone who knew that surviving mattered more than appearing a certain way. Her father had been a kind man who told her she was worth 10 of any girl in town and meant it, though he had said it quietly, as though it were the kind of truth that had to be protected from other people's opinions. Both of them were gone now. Her father from a fever 2 winters back, her mother from grief 7 months later, though the doctor had written heart failure on the papers, and hadn't been wrong exactly. The boarding house they'd spent 30 years building had been sold to cover debts Maggie hadn't known existed until the bank's man arrived with documents and a practiced look of professional sympathy. She had tried to find work. She had walked into every kitchen and every hotel and every establishment in Dodge City that had any use for a woman who could cook, and she had left most of them with the same careful, dismissive courtesy that Clara Hofstede had offered her that morning. The words changed, the meaning never did. You understand. She understood fine. What she was less certain about was how much longer she could afford to understand before understanding started to feel like agreement. Birch dropped her at the end of a long dirt track that disappeared between 2 stands of cottonwood, pointed south, and told her the ranch house was about half a mile in. She thanked him and walked. The carpetbag was heavier than it looked, and she'd packed it badly, corner of her hairbrush digging into her palm through the worn leather. But she kept walking because stopping never helped anything. The first thing she saw of the Rourke Ranch was the fence. Someone had repaired it recently, new posts, clean wire, the kind of work that said the man running this place was not letting it fall apart, even if it wasn't prospering exactly. The second thing she saw was a vegetable garden, or what had been one. The plants were pulled and frost-blackened now, but the beds were still edged and ordered, stakes still standing. Someone had cared about that garden. The care was old now, but it was still visible. The house itself was solid. 2 stories, weathered gray wood, porch running the full length of the front, a barn 30 yards behind it, a smaller outbuilding to the east, a chicken coop she could hear before she saw, smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, a rocker on the porch with no one in it. She knocked on the front door. The silence that followed was longer than she expected. Then footsteps heavy, measured a man's and the door opened. Elias Rourke was taller than she'd pictured from the terseness of the advertisement, though she wasn't sure why she'd pictured anything. He had the build of a man who worked with his body every day, broad through the shoulders, hands that looked like they'd been roughened by something stronger than weather, dark hair not quite combed, eyes the color of creek water in autumn brown with something greenish underneath, hard to name exactly. He was maybe 35. He might have been younger and simply worn. He looked at her the way she'd learned to read the quick, involuntary assessment, the microsecond of recalibration, when people processed what they were seeing and adjusted their expectations accordingly. He did it, she noticed. Neither of them acknowledged it. "Margaret Whitmore," she said. "I'm here about the position." He stepped back from the door. "Come in." The kitchen was the best room in the house. She could tell that immediately. The rest of the front hall was clean but spare a coat rack with 2 jackets on it, a mud-scraped mat, a side table with nothing on it except a battered lantern. The parlor she glimpsed through a half-open door had furniture that looked like it was being used carefully rather than comfortably. The way people sit in rooms they don't quite know what to do with anymore. But the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and old bread and iron, and the stove was a good one, a Charter oak, 8 years old maybe, but well-maintained, and the shelves were organized with the precision of someone who had once known exactly where everything should be. Elias Rourke pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, not the one at the head, and sat. He gestured at the chair across from him without ceremony. Maggie set her bag down and sat. "You cook," he said. "I've been cooking since I was 6 years old. My mother ran a boarding house. I fed 12 people 3 meals a day for most of my adult life." She paused. "I bake well. I put up preserves. I can manage a kitchen budget, and I don't waste. I'm not afraid of hard work." He looked at her steadily. He didn't write anything down, which she found either encouraging or worrying. "What about children?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I enjoy them," she said. "I'm patient, not endlessly patient. I don't think children benefit from endless patience. It makes them think everything's negotiable, but I'm fair." Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't a smile, more like the recognition of something unexpected. "Mabel is 6, he said. "She's not difficult. He stopped, seemed to choose the next word with unusual care. "She's particular. Most interesting children are." He looked at her again. Then he stood, moved to the foot of the stairs, and called up Mabel. "Come down." The pause from upstairs lasted just long enough to suggest that Mabel had already been at the top of the stairs listening, and was now calculating how long she needed to wait before coming down without making that obvious. Then small footsteps, quick and deliberate, and a 6-year-old girl appeared at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Maggie with eyes that were her father's color, but held considerably more activity in them. She had dark braids, one looser than the other, and a dress that was clean, but had been ironed by someone who didn't entirely know how. Her feet were bare despite the cold of the floorboards. She stood very straight in the way small children do when they are performing composure, and she studied Maggie with the frank, unguarded assessment that only children and certain kinds of difficult adults are willing to exercise. "This is Margaret Whitmore," Elias said. "She's here about the cook position." Mabel said nothing. She kept looking at Maggie with that concentrated, measuring gaze. Maggie looked back at her without flinching. She did not smile brightly. She did not say, "Swell. Hello there. Aren't you something?" or any of the other things adults said to children when they didn't know what else to do. She simply waited. "What kind of pies do you make?" Mabel said. "Apple peach when I have the fruit. Cherry, vinegar pie if the pantry's sparse. Beef and potato if we're talking savory. I make a decent custard, but I won't pretend it's my strongest work." Mabel absorbed this. Our last cook couldn't make pie at all. She said pies were for people with too much time. "That's a strange opinion for a cook," Maggie said. "I thought so too." "A beat. Do you know any stories?" "A fair number. What kind?" "The kind with people in them. Adventures, some of them funny, 1 or 2 that are sad." She paused. "Children your age usually like the ones where someone figures out how to solve something that looked impossible." Mabel's expression remained carefully neutral, but she took 2 steps closer to the table. "Do you like flowers?" "I like gardens," Maggie said. "Flowers included. I'm better at growing vegetables, but I appreciate a flower garden." "Mama had a flower garden," Mabel said. Then her face changed, not collapsing. Nothing that dramatic, just a subtle tightening, like a door closing quietly. She glanced at her father. Elias was looking at the window. His jaw had moved once, the muscle in his cheek catching and releasing. He didn't look back at his daughter. Maggie said nothing. She let the moment be what it was. After a moment, Mabel looked at her again. Do you know how to braid hair? Papa tries, but it comes out lopsided. I can braid hair, both sides, both sides. Same tension. Mabel nodded once slowly, with the gravity of someone confirming a significant logistical matter. Then she turned and walked back up the stairs without another word. Elias finally looked away from the window. He picked up his coffee cup and realized it was empty and set it down again. The position is 6 days a week, he said. Sundays you're free. You'd have the spare room upstairs. Pay is $8 a month, plus what I said in the advertisement. He hesitated. Then, with the carefully measured tone of a man covering uncomfortable territory, my wife passed 2 years ago. I run this place with 2 hired hands, Caleb and Jonas. They eat with us most days. Another pause. I'm not looking for anything beyond what I advertised. I'm not offering anything beyond what I applied for, Maggie said. He met her eyes. Something that might have been relief crossed his face, though he wouldn't have named it that. When can you start, he said. I already started, she said. That coffee cup is empty, and there's a stove right there. She started in the kitchen that same afternoon, and what she found was a pantry that told the story of 2 years of grief with more honesty than any account Elias Rourke would ever give her directly. There was food. Enough food a working rancher made sure of that at minimum. But the spices were in the wrong jars, relabeled in a child's handwriting, which told her Mabel had reorganized the shelves herself at some point and gotten the containers mixed up. There were 3 half-used tins of coffee on the same shelf as if no one had thought to consolidate them. A crock of lard had been put back without the lid sealed properly and had gone slightly rancid. The onion bin had onions in it that were still good but had been stored with potatoes, and the potatoes were starting to soften. She dealt with these things quietly, one at a time, without comment. She found the right lids, sorted the jars, moved the potatoes to a lower shelf. She got a fire going in the charter oak and set water to boil, and took inventory of what she actually had to work with for supper. Mabel appeared in the doorway at 4:30, still barefoot. You're reorganizing, she said. A little Papa doesn't like it when things move. I'm keeping everything in the same general area, Maggie said, just putting like with like. He'll find things faster, not slower. Mabel came into the kitchen and climbed onto the stool beside the work table without being invited, which told Maggie she'd done it before, with someone else, and still considered it hers to do. What are you making? Beef stew. We had the makings. And biscuits if there's enough flour. There's flour. A pause. Mrs. Hatch made stew, but it was thin. Papa didn't say so, but I could tell. How could you tell? He ate it all the way through without saying anything. When he likes food, he says something small. Like, this is good, Mabel, or just, When he doesn't like it, he's quiet. Maggie stirred the beginning of a roux. Let it catch just slightly before adding stock. He seems like a quiet man generally. He used to talk more, Mabel said, with the matter-of-fact simplicity of a child reporting a geological fact. Before Mama got sick, he used to laugh sometimes. Not now, mostly. She was quiet for a moment, watching Maggie's hands. Are you going to stay? I was hired for the position. That's not what I asked. Maggie looked at her. The girl met her eyes without deflecting. There was something unnerving and also entirely admirable about the directness of her. I don't know yet, Maggie said. That's the honest answer. I hope so. Mabel seemed to accept this. She picked up a dried bean that had escaped the crock and turned it over in her fingers. Mrs. Hatch left after 3 weeks. Mrs. Calloway left after 5 days. Miss Bremer lasted the longest, but she got married to someone in town. She set the bean down. I think they left because it was too quiet here. I don't mind quiet, Maggie said. Miss Bremer said that too at first. Maggie looked at the child and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. She went back to the stew. Supper that evening was the first real meal the Rourke kitchen had produced in some time, and Maggie knew it from the way the 2 hired hands, Caleb, who was young and talked a great deal, and Jonas, who was older and talked almost none, both went still when they first tasted it. Elias ate with the steady attention of a man who'd been eating for fuel rather than pleasure for longer than he'd noticed. At the end of the meal, when the biscuits were gone and the stew pot was nearly empty, he picked up his coffee cup and said, without looking at anyone in particular, "This is good." Mabel across the table caught Maggie's eye. She did not smile, but her expression communicated something with the clarity of a spoken sentence. I told you so. The first 2 weeks at the Rourke Ranch proceeded with the careful momentum of something trying not to get ahead of itself. Maggie woke before the sun every morning. The cold in the upstairs room was serious. The spare room had 1 window, and the draft around the frame wasn't properly sealed, and she woke the second morning to her breath visible above the quilt. But she'd lived through hard winters in a boarding house, where the boarders complained about heat, and the fuel costs kept her mother up at night. And she knew the cold was manageable if you moved into it immediately, rather than dreading it from beneath the covers. She dressed, went downstairs, built up the fire in the charter oak, and had coffee ready before Elias came through the kitchen on his way to the barn. He didn't stop the first morning. The second morning he paused, looked at the coffee, poured himself a cup, and stood by the stove for a moment without speaking. Then he went out. By the end of the first week, he was staying in the kitchen for 15 minutes while Maggie put together breakfast. He didn't say much, but he was there. Mabel attached herself to Maggie with the determined loyalty of a child who had decided something and wasn't interested in being argued out of it. She sat on her stool in the kitchen every morning and asked questions about food, about Dodge City, about what grew in a garden in summer, about whether fish could really be cooked in ways that didn't make the whole house smell. She carried dishes to the table with painstaking care, one in each hand, her small face concentrated with effort. She began telling Maggie things about the ranch. This fence post had been replaced last spring. That chicken was the mean one and would come at your ankles if you moved too fast. The big cottonwood by the creek had a branch you could sit on if you were the right size. On the 9th day, Mabel asked if Maggie would braid her hair. Maggie sat her down on the kitchen stool and worked slowly, carefully, separating the dark strands with the patience she'd learned from her mother, who had braided the hair of every female boarder who'd ever asked. She got both sides even. She secured them with the ribbons Mabel provided, dark blue ones that had seen better days. Mabel sat very still throughout. When it was done, she touched both braids with her fingertips, checking the tensions, and said, "You did both sides the same." I said I would. "Papa does one tighter than the other. He doesn't mean to." "It's harder than it looks," Maggie said. "I know." Mabel turned around on the stool to look at her. "Don't tell him I said that. I wasn't planning to." The girl studied her for a moment. "He tries very hard," she said. "At everything. He just doesn't always know what the thing is supposed to look like." Maggie looked at the child's face, so serious, so carefully carrying something too heavy for her small frame, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not pity. She had very little patience for pity, given how much of it had been aimed at her over the years as a substitute for actual regard. It was something closer to recognition, the particular loneliness of being the person in a household who sees everything and doesn't know who to tell. "You don't have to manage him," Maggie said carefully. Mabel blinked. "Someone has to. He's your father." "I know that." She turned back around on the stool. "Can we talk about something else?" "What do you want to talk about?" "Tell me about the boarding house," Mabel said. "What was it like?" And Maggie told her. She told her about the long kitchen that had been her entire world from age 6 onward, the smell of breakfast before dawn, the way the boarders came and went, salesmen, drifters, a schoolteacher once who stayed 3 months and read to everyone after supper whether they wanted to hear it or not. She talked about her mother, who had run the place with an iron efficiency that looked like calm to outsiders, but was actually carefully managed chaos. She talked about her father, who had repaired everything that broke and argued with the bank, and made her feel, from the time she was small, that the life they were living was substantial, regardless of how it looked to people who didn't have to live it. She did not talk about the foreclosure. She did not talk about the 7 months of trying to find work and being turned away. She did not talk about Clara Hofstede. But Mabel, listening on her stool with her chin in her hands, heard something in what Maggie didn't say, and she said, "Did you have to leave?" "Yes, because of money?" "Because of several things." Mabel was quiet for a moment. "Then Papa almost had to leave here too. After Mama died, the bank man came twice. Caleb told me." She paused. "Papa doesn't know I know that." "People generally know more than we think they do," Maggie said. "Is that from a story?" "That's from life." She moved to the work table to start on the bread. Same thing most of the time. On the 14th day, Elias Rourke came in from the north pasture in the early afternoon when he wasn't expected, and found Maggie in the spare room. Not her spare room. The other one, the room at the end of the hall that she'd assumed was storage, given the boxes and the sheet draped over a rocking chair. She'd only gone in to check whether there were additional preserving jars that might be useful, because the ones in the pantry were running short. She'd found a wooden box on the shelf behind the jars and taken it down, thinking it might be empty. It wasn't. She had it open when she heard his boots on the stairs. The letters were in her hands, 3 of them, unsealed, written in a woman's handwriting on cream-colored paper that had the slightly deliberate quality of someone choosing each word carefully. She had read exactly 6 lines of the first one before she realized what she was holding. The door swung open. Elias stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the box in her hands. Something crossed his face that she hadn't seen before. And she'd been watching his face for 2 weeks. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something rawer and less controlled, something that arrived before he had a chance to manage it. Maggie set the letters back in the box and set the box on the shelf in one careful motion. "I was looking for preserving jars," she said. "I shouldn't have opened it. I'm sorry to move from the doorway. I read 6 lines," as she said. "I stopped when I understood what they were." He was still looking at the box on the shelf, not at her. "They're letters," he said finally. His voice had gone somewhere flat and careful. "She wrote them when she knew she wasn't going to." He stopped. Tried again. She wanted Mabel to have something, for later. For the time she wouldn't be there for. A pause that had something breaking quietly inside it. "I haven't given them to her yet, Mabel. I don't know when the right time is." Maggie said nothing, because the sentence didn't have a place for a response. "There's one for her first day of school," Elias said. "She already had that, but I didn't." He pressed his mouth together. "There's one for her 16th birthday. One for the day she gets married." He looked at Maggie now, and his eyes were dry, but there was something in them that had stopped being controlled some years ago, and simply lived there permanently now. Evelyn was very organized. About everything. She was the kind of woman who made lists. She could look at a situation and know what was needed before anyone else saw it. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Maggie said. "She was better than I deserved," he said. It didn't sound like a compliment to himself. It sounded like a fact he'd been living with. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "Before she died," he said, "she made me promise something. She told me that one day, when I was ready, if I was ever ready to find someone who could love Mabel." He said the word love with the uncomfortable formality of a man who didn't use it often and felt slightly exposed when he had to. "Someone who could bring warmth back into this house." Her word warmth, he paused. "I told her I would." Maggie waited. "I've tried," he said, "to keep the promise. 7 women in 2 years. All of them fine people, probably. Good people." His jaw shifted. Mabel didn't want any of them. She found something wrong with each one by the end of the first week. Too loud, too particular about her things. Didn't know how to talk to children. Didn't like the smell of horses. He said this last one with something that was almost barely, a darkened shade of amusement. "I started to think she'd never accept anyone. And then?" Maggie said, because the story clearly had a then. He looked at her with that direct, unreadable Creekwater gaze. "And then she told me she'd heard about a woman in Dodge City who made the best pies in the county," from Caleb, who'd heard it from someone at the feed store. He let that sit for a moment. "I don't think she actually cared about the pies." Maggie was quiet. "She picked the advertisement herself," he said. "The wording, she told me what to write. Must be good with children." He said the last 4 words in his daughter's voice, a perfectly accurate 3-syllable impression that lasted only a moment before he recollected himself. She was very specific about that part. Maggie looked at the box on the shelf, then at the man in the doorway. She thought about a 6-year-old girl making lists of what her family needed, the way her mother had made lists, reorganizing the spice jars, climbing the stool in the kitchen with complete territorial confidence. Someone has to manage him. She thought about the looseness of Mabel's left braid, morning after morning, before Maggie had arrived. The dry rancid lard, the 3 half-used tins of coffee. She thought about herself on the road into town with a folded application in her hand and nowhere to go. She felt something in her chest that was large and complicated, and she had no name for immediately, so she let it be unnamed for the time being. "The preserving jars," she said. "Are they in this room or somewhere else?" Elias blinked. Then he moved to the shelf, reached past the box, and handed her 3 empty jars without a word. "Thank you," she said. She walked past him out of the room. He stood in the doorway of his late wife's carefully organized hope and listened to her footsteps go down the hall. And the particular quality of the silence that followed was, if not lighter exactly, at least a fraction less solid than it had been before. That night, after supper, after Mabel had been read to, and had protested and fallen asleep mid-protest in the particular way of children who fight sleep and lose comprehensively, sat at the kitchen table with her mending and thought very carefully about what Elias Rourke had told her. She thought about the promise he'd made to his dying wife. She thought about the 6-year-old who had quietly engineered her own family. She thought about the fact that she was sitting in this kitchen, in this chair, beside this stove, because a small particular child had heard about her pies from a man at a feed store. She thought about Clara Hofstede, who had folded her application twice and told her she understood. She did understand, finally, just not what Clara had meant. She understood that the things that had followed her through life, the looks, the adjustments, the women who had formed opinions before she could speak, none of them had known anything true about her. They had looked at her body and made their calculations and missed everything that actually mattered, because what actually mattered was in her hands and her mind, and whatever it was in her that had never, not once, seriously considered giving up. And now here she was in a kitchen that needed her, with a child who had picked her specifically, and a man who was making himself look at his dead wife's letters and trying to decide whether the world still had anything worth wanting in it. She wasn't going to walk away from this. She'd known that since the first evening, probably. Since Mabel had looked at her on the stairs with those measuring eyes and asked her about pies with the gravity of a woman evaluating a business partner. She was going to stay. And she was going to be, for as long as they would have her, the warmth that Evelyn Rourke had seen coming before anyone else knew there was anything to look for. She tied off her mending thread, trimmed the lamp wick, and went upstairs to the room with the drafty window. And she did not lie awake worrying. She had work to do in the morning. The draft window sealed itself against the cold sometime in the third week of October. Though not through any great repair, Maggie had simply found a strip of old flannel in the mending box and pressed it along the gap until the worst of the draft stopped. It wasn't elegant, it held. She had come to understand the operating principle of the Rourke Ranch. Nothing here was elegant. Everything held. She had been at the ranch for 3 weeks when she realized she had stopped counting the days in the way she'd counted them in Dodge City, where each morning began with the arithmetic of what she still had and how long it could last. Here the days had a different texture in a way that left her tired by evening but not depleted, not the hollow tired of worry and waiting. She woke before sunrise, built the fire, made coffee, started whatever the morning required. The hours moved through her hands in the form of dough and soap and mended hems and braided hair, and when she fell asleep at night, it was with the uncomplicated heaviness of someone who had spent the day usefully. Mabel had started waiting for her at the top of the stairs each morning, not obviously. The girl would appear in the hallway, with her hair still loose, and her expression carefully arranged to suggest she had simply happened to be there, not that she had been listening for the sound of Maggie's door. Maggie never said anything about it. She simply paused at the top of the stairs and said good morning, and waited for Mabel to fall into step beside her, which Mabel did every time with the dignified air of someone who had made an independent decision that happened to align with yours. They went to the kitchen together. Mabel climbed her stool. Maggie started breakfast. The arrangement had the settled comfort of something much older than 3 weeks, which either said something about the two of them or said something about how hungry a household could get for ordinary routine. It was during these mornings that Maggie learned most of what she knew about the Rourke Ranch. Not from Elias, who volunteered nothing personal and responded to direct questions with the minimum necessary words, but from Mabel, who had apparently been storing observations for 2 years with no adequate audience, and was now releasing them at the rate of a woman unpacking a very full trunk. She learned that Elias had grown up on this land. His father had built the original 2 rooms of the house, and Elias had since added the second story the year he married Evelyn. She learned that Caleb, the younger hired hand, had a girl in town he was trying to work up the courage to speak to, and that Jonas had been at the ranch longer than Mabel had been alive, and was, in Mabel's estimation, the most reliable person on the property, including her father. She learned that Evelyn Rourke had kept the accounts herself in a ledger that was still in the desk drawer in the study, and that no one had opened it since she died. She learned that Mabel had nightmares sometimes, though the girl didn't use that word. She said she woke up sometimes, and the house felt wrong, and she went to her father's room, and he never said anything, just moved over and let her sit on the edge of the bed until she fell back asleep. She said this with the same factual neutrality with which she reported everything, but she was looking at the work table when she said it, and she didn't say anything further on the subject. Maggie went on kneading bread. "The window in your room looks east," Maggie said. "In the mornings when it's clear, you can see the sky go from black to purple, to that particular orange that only lasts about 30 seconds. I've started watching for it." Mabel looked up. Missa used to say the sky in Kansas was the best thing about Kansas. Better than anything men built. She was probably right, Maggie said. Mabel returned to the beans she was sorting. "Do you like it here?" "I do," Maggie said, and meant it simply, without qualification. "Even though it's far from town?" "Especially because of that." The girl considered this. "Caleb says you're the best cook the ranch has ever had. He said it to Jonas when he didn't think I was listening." "Caleb is generous." Jonas agreed with him, Mabel said. "Jonas never agrees with anyone." Maggie smiled at the dough. "Well then." Elias remained the most complicated part of her days, not because he was unkind, but because she was coming to understand a man who had organized his grief into a kind of structure, and the structure worked for him the way a cast works on a broken bone. It held everything in place. Nothing moved unnecessarily. And he had been in it long enough that he'd started to forget it was supposed to come off eventually. He came in for meals. He said what needed to be said about the ranch, about weather, about the condition of the north fence and the state of the cattle, and what Caleb had done wrong with the feed distribution. He ate. He thanked her, always briefly, without looking up from his plate, but consistently every meal which she counted as something, because it was clearly not a reflex but a decision. He went back out. He did not ask her anything about herself. She didn't take it personally. She recognized the behavior. She'd seen it in the boarding house, in men who came in after some kind of loss and rented a room and ate at the common table, and said only what was required of them socially, and spent the rest of their energy on the work of simply being present in the world, without anyone making more demands on them than that. What she noticed and tried not to notice too carefully, because noticing carefully felt like overstepping, was that he had started finding reasons to come back to the kitchen during the day. Not meals, not coffee. Small things. He needed the account book. He had left his gloves on the chair. He had not left his gloves on the chair. She'd seen him take them when he went out. He wanted to know if there was salt to spare for the barn, which was not a thing anyone had ever needed to check personally. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before whatever the stated errand was, and there was something in the way he stood there that she recognized as a man talking himself into something he hadn't quite admitted to himself yet. She didn't make it easier or harder. She acknowledged him when he came in, answered whatever he asked, went back to her work. She didn't perform busyness to shut him out, and she didn't create conversational openings that he'd then feel obligated to walk through. She just continued being where she was. On a Wednesday in late October, he stood in the kitchen doorway for longer than usual, and then said, without preamble, "Evelyn used to make something with the late apples. Some kind of cake. With the brown sugar, and I don't know what was in it. Mabel's been asking about it." Maggie looked up. "Apple cake. Brown sugar, cinnamon, a little nutmeg if you have it. Some people use lard in the batter. Some use butter. What do you have in the pantry?" He stood there. "I don't know. I don't go in the pantry." She didn't say anything about that. "I have both. I'll make one this weekend." He nodded. He turned to go, then stopped, his hand on the doorframe. He cleared his throat. "Mabel, she would have liked you." "Evelyn." He said it quickly, like pulling a splinter. She had good judgment about people fast. She usually knew inside the first 10 minutes. He left before Maggie could respond. She stood at the work table for a moment with her hands in the flour and thought that this was possibly the most generous thing anyone had said to her in a very long time, and that she was going to start somewhere careful and not examine it too closely just yet. She made the apple cake on Saturday. Mabel ate 2 slices and went very quiet, and her eyes got bright in a way that she was clearly working hard to manage. And she said, after a moment, "It tastes almost the same." "Recipes travel," Maggie said. "They end up in more than one kitchen." Elias had 1 slice. He put his fork down at the end of it and was quiet for a moment and then said, "It's right," just those 2 words. Caleb had 3 slices and was enthusiastic about all of them. Jonas has had one and said nothing. But he finished every crumb, which Mabel had already explained was the highest possible form of Jonas-based praise. November arrived with the particular bluntness that the Kansas plains did November not a gradual cooling but a shift, like a door closing, from one season to the next. The temperature dropped 17 degrees in a single night, and the wind came up from the north and didn't stop for 4 days. Maggie sealed the rest of the windows with flannel and lard cloth where needed, built the kitchen fire up in the evenings, and made soup 3 nights running because soup was what a household needed when the world outside turned hostile and the walls became the entire relevant world. On the second night of the cold stretch, Mabel appeared in the kitchen doorway at 10 o'clock in her nightgown, hair loose around her shoulders, and said, "I can't sleep." Maggie was still up. She often was, the evenings being the only time she had to herself. She was at the table with the mending basket and a lamp turned low. "Come sit down," she said. Mabel came in and climbed her stool, pulling her feet up off the cold floor. She sat with her arms wrapped around herself, watching the stove. "Bad dream?" Maggie said. "I don't remember." A pause. "I just woke up and it felt wrong. That happens." "Does it happen to you?" "Sometimes." Maggie cut a thread and set aside a mended sock. "When I was younger, it happened more. I would wake up, and the room would feel like it didn't have enough air in it, and I'd have to get up and move." "What did you do?" "Came downstairs and started something. Bread dough. Mending. Anything that used my hands and required enough attention that my mind had somewhere specific to go." Mabel looked at the basket. "Is that why you're still up?" "No, I just have a lot of mending." She smiled. "But it's the same principle." Mabel was quiet for a while. The fire shifted inside the stove, and the wind pressed against the window, and the house was otherwise silent. "Maggie," the girl said. Do you think Mama would be angry? That there's someone else in the kitchen?" Maggie set down what she was holding. She looked at Mabel, at the small, serious face, the question carried there with the careful tension of something that had been held for a while. "I think," she said, "that a woman who wrote letters to her daughter for every important moment of her future life was a woman who loved that daughter more than she loved any kitchen." She paused. "I don't think she'd be angry. I think she'd want to know if the stove was being treated right." Mabel almost smiled. She was particular about the stove. "I could tell. It's in good condition. Papa cleaned it after she died. He cleaned everything, actually, once." Another pause. "And then he stopped cleaning, and that's when the house started going bad." She said this without judgment, just observation. "He was doing his best, I think." He just didn't know what the best was supposed to look like anymore. That's a wise thing to notice, Maggie said. I'm 6, Mabel said. People think I don't notice things. People think that about women too, Maggie said. They're usually wrong about that also. Mabel looked at her with those old water eyes that held things in them. She didn't have words for yet. Then she climbed down off the stool, came around the table, and leaned against Maggie's arm with the uncalculated trust of a child who has decided where she belongs. Maggie stayed very still. She finished the piece of mending in her hands. Then she set it aside, and they sat together in the warm kitchen while the wind worked at the north wall. And neither of them said anything else for a while, because nothing else needed to be said. She was carrying water from the pump one morning, in the middle of November, when the bucket handle snapped. It was old iron, the kind that had been cold-stressed one winter too many, and it gave without warning, both buckets going into the mud beside the pump, water spreading cold across her boots and the lower half of her skirt. She stood there for a moment, looking at the mess with the flat, resigned expression of someone who has learned to evaluate disasters before reacting to them. That handle's been needing replacement since summer. She turned. Elias was coming around the corner of the barn, having apparently witnessed the collapse from some distance. He had the neutral face of a man, carefully not reacting to something he'd found mildly entertaining. I noticed it was loose this morning, Maggie said. I should have dealt with it then. I should have replaced it in August. He picked up one of the buckets. I'll get the water. Go change your boots before they freeze. My boots are fine. Your boots are soaked through. I've had wet boots before. He looked at her. She looked at him. He had the slightly frustrated expression of a man who had made a reasonable point and was now watching someone be unreasonable about it, purely on principle, and he was not entirely sure how to proceed. Go change your boots, he said with slightly more emphasis. I'll get the water. She went and changed her boots, because the reasonable position was the reasonable position regardless of who held it, and she had no actual argument against dry feet. He had the water inside and had found a replacement handle from the barn by the time she came back. He was fitting it to the pump when she returned to the kitchen, and she watched through the window for a moment as he worked the focused, efficient movements of a man who was good with his hands and didn't need an audience for it. She thought about what Mabel had said. He was doing his best. He just didn't know what the best was supposed to look like anymore. She'd known men like that. Not many. Her father, after a bad year when the boarding house nearly went under the first time, had gone quiet in a similar way, not cruel, not absent exactly, just operating at minimum, keeping the essential functions running while he figured out what else he still had the capacity for. What her mother had done, she remembered now, was not try to fix it. She had simply continued being present in the way she'd always been present, and she had waited, and she had trusted that the man she'd married was still in there and would come back out when he was ready. Maggie turned back to the stove. She found the ledger on a Thursday afternoon. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been looking for a second set of account books for the ranch. She'd started keeping track of the kitchen spending separately, a habit from the boarding house, and she'd begun to see patterns in where money was going and thought it worth making sure she wasn't missing anything. She'd gone into the study with Elias's permission, looking for a blank book, and she'd opened the desk drawer and seen Evelyn's ledger sitting there exactly, as Mabel had described it, undisturbed. She would have left it. She would have taken a blank book and left. But the ledger was sitting open, and the last entry was dated 15 months ago, in handwriting that was different from everything around it, more careful, more deliberate, like writing done by someone who was concentrating very hard, and it said, The Hendricks note comes due in March. Don't let them talk you out of the extension. You're owed it. The North Pasture water rights belong to this property. Get it in writing before spring. That was all. The rest of the page was blank. Maggie stood there for a long moment, looking at those 2 sentences, a dying woman's last recorded thought, aimed precisely and practically at her husband's future problems. No sentiment in it, just information he needed. She closed the ledger and put it back exactly where it had been. Then she sat down in the study chair, which creaked under her weight with the familiarity of something that had been sat in frequently, and thought about Evelyn Rourke, who had organized her family's grief into stamped envelopes and written account books, and the carefully worded advertisement in the Dodge City Standard. Must be good with children. She thought about what it meant to love something so well and so practically that even your dying was organized around making sure the thing survived after you. She stood up. She went back to the kitchen. She started supper. When Elias came in that evening, she said, The Hendricks note, is that settled? The extension from March? He went very still. He looked at her. How do you know about the Hendricks note? The ledger in the study. I opened it by accident. I saw the last entry. She held his gaze. I wasn't prying. I closed it. He was quiet for a long moment. His hands had gone to the back of the nearest chair, gripping it without apparent awareness. It's settled, he said finally. I got the extension. He tried to push me on the interest and I didn't move. Good, she said. And the North Pasture water rights, is that in writing? Something happened in his face that she couldn't entirely name. It was not grief, not exactly, though it was adjacent to it. It was the expression of a man who has received something through an unexpected channel and is still working out how to hold it. Not yet, he said. You should do that before spring, she said, and turned back to the stove, because she didn't want to make it into something larger than it was. It wasn't her business to make things larger. She was just a woman who'd seen 2 sentences in a ledger and thought they were worth passing along. He stood there behind her for a moment. Then he said very quietly she would have liked that someone else saw it. Maggie kept her back to him. She wrote it for someone to see. He didn't say anything after that, but he sat down at the kitchen table instead of going back out. And when Mabel came downstairs for supper half an hour later and found her father sitting in the kitchen while Maggie cooked, she stopped in the doorway and took in the scene with the careful, assessing look of a 6-year-old running calculations. Then she climbed her stool. What are we having, she said. Chicken, Maggie said. And the last of the corn. I like corn, Mabel said to the room in general. I know, said Maggie and Elias at almost exactly the same moment. A silence followed. Then Mabel started laughing, real laughter, sudden and uncontrolled and completely unguarded, the kind that hadn't had much room in this house for 2 years. And Elias looked startled for a moment, and then something in his face unlocked. And he laughed too, quiet and rusty, like something finding its way back through unfamiliar terrain. Maggie stirred the pot and said nothing, and felt something in her chest that she still hadn't found the right name for. But that was growing too large to remain unnamed for much longer. The letter arrived on a Friday, 3 weeks into November. It came with the mail rider who came out to the ranch twice a month, and it was addressed to Elias in a handwriting. Maggie didn't recognize a woman's writing, she thought, though she only saw it for a moment before Elias took it from Caleb. He read it, standing in the doorway of the barn, and whatever was in it changed something in his face, not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes. The kind of change that passes through quickly and leaves the face composed again. He didn't mention the letter at supper. Mabel asked him what was wrong, and he said nothing was wrong, and he passed her the biscuits. Maggie said nothing. She served dessert, which was apple preserves on bread, and she cleared the plates, and she sent Mabel to bed when the time came, and she was washing up alone in the kitchen when Elias came back downstairs. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. She heard him there before she saw him. Vivian Mercer is coming, he said. She set down the dish she was drying. She'd heard the name before from Caleb in passing weeks ago. A neighboring valley, a widow, significant property. When? She said. 2 weeks. He leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms in the way he did when he was thinking about something he'd rather not be thinking about. She writes every few months. She has a proposal she wants to discuss. Maggie turned back to the dishes. What kind of proposal? He was quiet long enough that she looked at him again. The kind that has nothing to do with cattle or property lines, he said. She took that in. I see. I haven't encouraged it, he said, with the stiff care of a man making a clarification that matters to him. I've never given her any indication that He stopped. We've known each other since before Evelyn died. She's decided on her own that this is something worth pursuing. It's her right to think what she wants, Maggie said. I know. He watched her for a moment. I'm telling you because you're in this house. You should know who's coming. Maggie nodded. She finished the last of the dishes and set them in the rack and folded the cloth over the bar. Is she staying? I'll put her in the spare room. She usually stays 2 nights. He paused. She won't be discourteous. She's not a discourteous woman. He said this in the tone of a man covering something he hadn't quite finished deciding about, and Maggie heard what was underneath it, which was, she is a difficult woman, and I am choosing my words carefully because you are standing in my kitchen, and I owe you at least that much. I'll make up the spare room, Maggie said. You don't have... It's part of my position, she said, simply without edge. I'll see to it. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, I appreciate it, what you do here. I don't know if I say that enough. You say this is good every other meal, she said. For you, that's practically a speech. He blinked. Then brief, crooked, almost reluctant something that was unmistakably a smile crossed his face. It didn't last. But she saw it, and she was going to remember it. He went upstairs. She stood in the clean kitchen for a moment, listening to the house settle in the cold, and thought about a woman named Vivian Mercer, riding out from the neighboring valley in 2 weeks, with a proposal and significant property and opinions about what a successful rancher's life should look like. She thought about her own worn carpet bag in the upstairs room. She thought about Mabel's laugh at the dinner table. She finished trimming the lamp. She went upstairs to bed. The window with the flannel seal held against the cold all night, and if she lay awake for a while thinking about the weeks as, that was her own business. and she kept it contained to herself with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent most of her adult life handling difficult things quietly and getting up the next morning and making breakfast. She got up the next morning. She made breakfast. When Mabel appeared at the top of the stairs and fell into step beside her without saying anything, Maggie handed her the basket of eggs that needed to be collected from the coop and said, "I'm thinking of making biscuits with honey this morning. Instead of plain?" Instead of plain. Mabel weighed this with appropriate gravity. That sounds right, she decided. They went downstairs together, and the kitchen filled with the smell of wood smoke and coffee and something sweet in the making. And for that morning, that was enough. Vivian Mercer arrived on a Tuesday, which Maggie noted was a deliberate choice. Not a Monday, when a woman might excuse a long journey as reason enough for any roughness around the edges. Not a Wednesday, splitting the week in half with the efficiency of a business visit. Tuesday meant she had ridden out specifically, with adequate preparation, and intended to stay through Thursday long enough to make her presence felt, short enough to seem gracious about it. Maggie had the spare room made up by Sunday. She'd beaten the mattress, aired the quilts, replaced the stub of candle on the nightstand with a full one. She'd done it without being asked again and without commentary, because it was part of running a household well, and she ran the household at the Rourke Ranch, whether the person arriving was welcome or not. She heard the horse before she saw anything. A good horse, the hoofbeats had a certain confidence, a well-shod animal on a deliberate pace, not hurried. She was in the kitchen rolling out the midday biscuits when the sound reached her, and she finished rolling before she went to look. Vivian Mercer was perhaps 40, or could have been 35 if the years had been harder than her appearance suggested. She was handsome in the particular way of women who had made conscious decisions about how they presented themselves and followed through on those decisions daily. Her clothes were good quality, well-fitted, not ostentatious. She sat her horse like someone who had been doing it since childhood. She had dark hair pinned up under a traveling hat, and she dismounted with the practiced ease of a woman who didn't wait for assistance as a rule. Elias came around from the barn. Maggie watched from the kitchen window long enough to see the greeting Vivian extending her hand, Elias taking it briefly. Both of them talking in the way of people who have a shared history and are being careful about how much of it shows. Then she went back to the biscuits. She heard them come in through the front door. She heard Vivian's voice in the hall, a voice with good carrying power, the voice of a woman accustomed to filling rooms saying something about the road and the cold. She heard Elias's voice, lower, directing her toward the parlor. Then footsteps and the kitchen door opened. Maggie looked up. Vivian Mercer stood in the kitchen doorway and performed the same involuntary assessment that most people performed when they first saw Maggie, but she was faster about completing it, and her face settled into something more composed. She looked at the room first, the hanging herbs, the organized shelves, the bread dough, the clean stove, with the evaluating gaze of someone who ran her own household and was comparing notes. Then she looked at Maggie. "You must be the cook," she said. "Pleasant enough, entirely accurate, calibrated to land exactly as it did." "Margaret Whitmore," Maggie said. "You'll be in the spare room at the end of the hall. Supper is at 6. Elias mentioned you've been here since September." Vivian came into the kitchen without being invited, which was either natural ease or a territorial gesture, and Maggie didn't waste time deciding which. She moved to the shelves and looked at the organized jars with the expression of someone doing an inventory. "The house looks better than last time I visited." "When did you visit last June?" She turned. "The kitchen was a disaster in June. One of the Hatch women, I think. She'd let the pantry go completely." She picked up a jar, read the label, set it back. "You've done well with it." "Thank you," Maggie said. The word landed in the space between them. Not quite what it appeared, not quite the opposite. Maggie went back to cutting the biscuits. Vivian watched her work for a moment. "Where did you cook before this?" "My family's boarding house." "In Dodge City." "And now you're here," she said. The way people said things they meant to sound neutral but didn't. "Now I'm here," Maggie agreed. "A beat." "Elias needs a capable woman running this kitchen," Vivian said. "He's not suited to managing domestic matters on his own. He's an excellent rancher, but the house." She shook her head. The small, indulgent shake of a woman who had considered a man's limitations and found them forgivable. "He lets things go. It's the nature of men who prefer the outdoors." "He does well enough," Maggie said. "Of course." Vivian's smiled brief, careful. "Well, I'll leave you to it." She left. Maggie pressed the biscuit cutter into the dough and listened to the sound of Vivian Mercer's footsteps going back toward the parlor, and she thought, there it is, not the words. The structure beneath the words. The way a woman staked a position without appearing to stake anything through ownership of the appraisal, through the easy condescension toward the man being managed, through the gentle reminder that a cook was a cook, and a kitchen was a kitchen, and the rest was something else entirely. She had encountered this particular architecture before, dressed in different materials. She cut the rest of the biscuits without hurrying. Mabel came home from Mrs. Hadley's, where she spent 3 afternoons a week, nominally for lessons, actually for the company of the 2 Hadley children who were closest to her in age at 4:30. And Maggie heard her on the porch and then heard her stop. The stopping was the signal. Mabel never paused on the porch. She came straight in, shed her coat, appeared in the kitchen, asking what was for supper, with the directional certainty of a compass finding north. Today she paused. Maggie went to the kitchen doorway and looked down the hall. Mabel was standing inside the front door, coat still on, hat still on, looking at the parlor through the half-open door. Through the gap, Maggie could see Vivian Mercer sitting across from Elias, talking with the comfortable ease of someone who had done this many times and expected to continue doing it. Mabel's face was doing something complicated. Maggie said quietly, "Come take off your coat." Mabel came to the kitchen. She let Maggie take her hat and coat and sat on her stool, and she said nothing, which was its own kind of noise. "You've met her before?" Maggie said. "Twice." Her voice was flat in the way that children's voices go flat when they're covering something they don't have the words for yet. "The first time I was 5. She told Papa the house needed a woman's touch. She said it like I wasn't there." Maggie moved back to the stove. "And the second time?" A pause. "She said something about Mama's garden. That someone should pull it out and start fresh. That dead gardens were depressing." She said depressing, in Vivian's voice a light, airy word, something brushed aside. "Papa didn't say anything, he just went outside. That was unkind," Maggie said. "I know." Mabel looked at the work table. "She's going to try to talk to him about getting married. She does it every time." She said this with the resigned matter-of-factness of a child who has had to become an expert on adult behavior out of self-defense. "And he always says he'll think about it. And she always leaves and writes him letters, and then comes back and does it again." "Your father is a grown man," Maggie said carefully. "Whatever he decides is his to decide." Mabel looked at her with those old water eyes. "Do you think he's going to say yes this time?" Maggie was quiet for a moment. She thought about the kitchen at 6 in the morning. She thought about a man who came inside to collect gloves he hadn't left. She thought about "this is good," said to no one in particular over an apple cake. "I think," she said, "that your father is figuring something out. I don't know what he'll decide, but I think he's still figuring it." She paused. "That's not nothing." Mabel appeared to weigh this. Then she slid off the stool. "I'm going to help you with supper." "You don't have to, I want to." She went to the basin to wash her hands. "I'd rather be in here anyway." Supper that evening was the longest meal Maggie had cooked at the Rourke Ranch, not in time but in weight. Vivian was polished at a dinner table. She talked with the practiced ease of a woman who understood that conversation was a tool, who knew how to draw a man out and when to defer and when to redirect, and she directed the majority of her attention at Elias with the focused warmth of someone conducting a deliberate campaign. She asked about the cattle numbers, about the north pasture, about the Hendricks situation, in a way that suggested she already knew about it, which meant Elias had mentioned it to her at some point, which was a different kind of information. She said almost nothing to Mabel. Not rudely, carefully. The occasional glance, the occasional small smile, the precisely managed minimum of acknowledgement that communicated the child was noted, and not central to the relevant business of the evening. Mabel ate quietly and watched everything. Caleb, who was eating with them as usual, was clearly uncomfortable in a way that manifested as excessive enthusiasm for the biscuits. Jonas ate with his customary silence and gave Vivian one long look at the beginning of the meal and then apparently decided what he thought and put it away. Vivian looked at Maggie twice during supper. The first time to request the salt, which was a test of something response time, deference, the ease with which Maggie could be directed. Maggie passed the salt without comment. The second time was near the end of the meal, when Vivian made an observation about the stew. "This is very filling," she said, the way a woman says something that means something else. "Cold weather," Maggie said. "People need more, of course." A smile, the kind that arrived and departed without reaching the eyes. "Though I always think a lighter hand in the kitchen is something of a gift. So easy to overdo." The table went slightly quiet. Caleb studied his bowl. Jonas reached for his bread with the deliberateness of a man declining to be part of whatever was happening. Elias looked at Vivian, then at Maggie. His expression had gone careful in the way it went when he was processing something and hadn't decided yet. Mabel set her spoon down. She set it down with a precision that drew attention without being loud about it, and she said, in the clear, even voice of a 6-year-old who has been saving something, "Maggie's stew is the best thing I've eaten since Mama was alive." The sentence sat on the table. Vivian's smile stayed in place. It was a good smile, but something behind it adjusted. "That's sweet," Vivian said to Mabel with the tone women use on children when they are waiting for them to stop talking. It's not sweet, Mabel said. It's true. She picked up her spoon again. There's a difference, Elias coughed. Caleb turned it into something about needing more biscuits. Jonas kept eating. Maggie went to the stove to check the coffee. She kept her back to the table long enough for the moment to pass. But she'd heard it, and she thought not with triumph, because triumph was too simple, she thought. That child. 2 days were a long time under certain conditions. Vivian managed the house as a guest with the careful skill of a woman who understood exactly how much and how little space to take up. She was up early. She was pleasant at breakfast. She spent the mornings talking with Elias about the ranch and the afternoons, finding small ways to be visible reading in the parlor, walking the property line with Elias in the afternoon, sitting near the fire in the evenings with a piece of needlework she carried in her bag. She spoke to Maggie 3 times in 2 days. Each time was functional. Each time landed slightly wrong in the way of a musical note that's almost in tune. On Wednesday afternoon, Maggie was in the cold room off the kitchen, sorting through the remaining root vegetables when she heard Vivian's voice from the kitchen. She'd come in, hadn't seen Maggie through the partly closed door. She heard Elias's voice too. She wasn't trying to listen. She went on sorting quietly, because stopping to be obvious about not listening was its own problem. Reasonable proposal, Vivian was saying. I'm not asking for anything dramatic. A simple arrangement. The properties combined would give you twice the water access you have now, and my holdings in the valley cover. Vivian. Elias's voice. Flat, careful. We've talked about this. We've talked around it, she said. There's a difference. A pause. Elias, you're a practical man. You know what this ranch needs. You can't run it alone indefinitely, and Mabel needs. Mabel is fine. She needs a mother. Quieter now, with the practiced softness of someone deploying gentleness as precision. You know she does. Someone who can give her what a child requires. You can't do it all yourself. And the woman you have cooking, she stopped herself, and the stop was more revealing than what she'd been about to say. Silence. What about her? Elias said, and his voice had changed. Not louder. Precisely the opposite. She's capable, Vivian said. I'm not disputing her capability. But Elias, you need someone who can stand beside you. Someone who can manage the social aspect of things, represent the ranch when you need representing, be present at the Cattlemen's Association dinners, maintain the image, he said. A different kind of silence. Maggie set down the turnip she was holding. I only mean, Vivian began. I know what you mean, Elias said. Maggie heard footsteps moving toward the back door, then stopping. I'll think about what you've said, he told her. The courtesy of a man closing a door without slamming it. The back door opened and closed. Maggie stayed in the cold room for another few minutes, finishing what she'd come to do, because the vegetables still needed sorting regardless of what she'd heard, and because she had long since learned that the world did not pause its requirements to accommodate her emotional responses to things. She came back into the kitchen. Vivian was standing at the window. She turned when she heard Maggie, and her composure was intact, almost intact. There was a tightness around her eyes that she hadn't quite put away yet. She looked at Maggie with something that was close to honest for a moment. Then it passed. The stove needs more wood, she said. I'll see to it, Maggie said. That evening was the autumn picnic, which had not been a plan so much as a thing that happened. Elias had come back in from wherever he'd gone after the kitchen conversation, and said he was taking Mabel out to the South Creek before the light went because she'd been asking about it for a week. He said it to Maggie, not as an invitation, just informing her. Maggie said she would put together something cold to take along, because Mabel hadn't had a proper afternoon meal and would be hungry. Elias said that made sense. Vivian indicated she would rest at the house. The 3 of them walked out to the South Creek in the late afternoon, Elias, Mabel, and Maggie, with a cloth bundle containing biscuits and hard cheese and 2 apples, and the sky was the color it got in Kansas in November when the weather was undecided, pale gray at the horizon, warmer toward the west where the sun was dropping. Mabel ran ahead on the path. She knew it well, the particular competence of a child on familiar ground. Elias walked beside Maggie. He didn't say anything for a while. She didn't fill the quiet. She'd gotten better at that. The Rourke Ranch had taught her that silence between people didn't require management. After a while he said, She's been going on about the creek because she wants to show you where the crawfish live. Under the 3rd flat rock from the big willow, he paused. I don't know how she knows which rock it is. She just does. She knows where everything is on this property, Maggie said. She does. He watched his daughter disappear around the curve of the path. She's been that way since she could walk. Evelyn used to say she was mapping the world. A pause. She mapped the boarding house too, I'd guess. The minute she got here. Within the first hour, Maggie said, which was true. He almost smiled. I believe it. They found Mabel at the flat rock, already on her knees in the mud at the edge of the creek with her sleeves rolled, completely unconcerned about her dress. demonstrating the existence of a very small crawfish to an audience of two adults who were both trying not to be charmed by it and failing. See, she said, right there. They live under this rock all winter. I don't know how they don't freeze, probably go deeper, Elias said. Into the mud where it's warmer. Mabel looked at the rock. That seems uncomfortable. Might be. But they survive it. Mabel considered this with her head tilted, and then she said, I should go see if there are any under the next rock, and moved 20 feet up the bank with purposeful efficiency, which was clearly the arrangement she'd had in mind all along. The silence that followed was different from the one on the path. Elias stood beside Maggie at the edge of the creek and looked at the water, which was moving slowly, cold and clear over the flat stones. I heard what she said, Maggie said. She said it quietly, without build-up. At supper about the image. He didn't look at her. She said something similar to me this afternoon. I know, I was in the cold room, I wasn't trying to listen. I know you weren't. He was quiet for a moment. She's not a malicious woman. She's practical. She looks at a situation and she calculates. So do most people. She calculated wrong about some things. He picked up a small stone, turned it over in his fingers, set it back down. She looks at you and she sees a liability, something that complicates what she wants. He paused. She doesn't see what she's actually looking at. The creek moved between them and the world. Maggie said, what is she actually looking at? He turned to her then. He looked at her with those creek water eyes that were complicated in ways she was still learning and said, I don't know the words for it. I don't have the words for most things, he stopped. I know that Mabel laughs now. I know that the house smells like bread in the morning. I know that I came inside 5 times last week for no reason. He stopped again. That's what she's looking at. Maggie held very still. Down the bank, Mabel was narrating something to herself about a second crawfish. I'm not trying to... He pressed his mouth together. I don't want to make this into something that puts you in a bad position. You work here, that's a fact, and I haven't forgotten it. I haven't forgotten it either, she said, but I want you to know. His voice had dropped to the register he used when he meant something carefully. That what she was implying about you not being appropriate, about the image that is not something I agree with. I don't want you thinking I heard that and didn't object to it. She looked at him. He held the look without deflecting, which cost him something, she could see that. Thank you, she said. It was insufficient and accurate at the same time. He nodded once, and he was about to look away when Mabel shouted from up the bank. There are definitely two, and one of them is much bigger. She appeared around the bend of willows, muddy to the elbows, wholly pleased with herself. Papa, come look, you have to see the big one, Elias went. He went to his daughter and crouched at the edge of the water and looked at the crawfish with the concentrated attention of a man taking something seriously because it mattered to someone he loved. And Maggie stood at the creek's edge and watched the two of them and felt the thing in her chest that had no name, yet continue expanding quietly into all the space it had been waiting for. Vivian left the following morning. She left with the composed pleasantness of a woman who had decided something without letting it show, and she said goodbye to Elias at the porch with the measured warmth of someone keeping options open. And she looked at Maggie once before she mounted and said, You run a tidy kitchen, Miss Whitmore. Thank you, Maggie said. Vivian looked at her for a moment longer, really looked, with something sharper and more honest than she'd managed during her entire visit. Then she turned her horse and rode. Maggie stood on the porch until she was gone. Then she went inside and made coffee and started on the bread, and Mabel appeared at the kitchen door with her hair down and said, Is she gone? She's gone. Mabel came in and climbed her stool and picked up the bean sorting from where she'd left it the day before. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, She told me once that Mama's garden should be turned over for a vegetable plot. That flowers weren't practical on a working ranch. Maggie was quiet. It made me so angry, Mabel said. I couldn't say anything because I didn't have the right words yet. I was 5. Do you have the right words now? Mabel sorted 3 beans before she answered. I think the right words are, that's not yours to decide. Her voice was 6 years old and entirely certain. It's not her garden. She didn't plant it. She doesn't know what it costs to plant it. Maggie looked at the child on the stool, thin-wristed, muddy-elbowed from yesterday still, carrying 2 years of something in her small frame with a dignity that had not come from nowhere. That's exactly right, Maggie said. Mabel nodded once, as if filing it away. Then, Maggie, you're not going to leave, are you? The question arrived without warning, the way Mabel's questions usually did. Maggie looked at her. Where did that come from? She made me nervous, Mabel said. She makes things feel like they could change, like they're not certain. She looked at the beans in her hands. I don't like things being uncertain. Some things are certain, Maggie said. Like what? Maggie thought about it. She thought about a letter in a ledger. She thought about a creek rock and 2 crawfish, and a man who didn't have the words for most things. She thought about the flannel on the window that was still holding against the cold. Like the fact that the bread won't make itself, she said, and the fact that you're going to help me with it. Mabel looked at her for a moment long, measuring 6 years old and ancient at the same time. That's not what I asked, she said. No, Maggie agreed. But I'm still here, that's not nothing. Mabel appeared to accept this. She climbed down from her stool and went to wash her hands. 3 days after Vivian left, the first real snow of November came in overnight and settled everything: the yard, the bare branches of the cottonwood, the woodpile, the dead stalks of Evelyn's flower garden under 6 inches of white. Maggie woke before dawn, built the fire, stood at the kitchen window with her coffee, and looked at the altered world outside. Snow changed the geometry of a place. It simplified things, covered what was complicated, made the outlines clear. She heard him on the stairs. Elias came into the kitchen earlier than usual, still pulling on his second layer, and stopped when he saw her at the window. Snow, she said, I see it. He came to the stove, poured coffee, stood on the other side of the window. They looked at the yard together for a moment. I need to get to the cattle early. The north pasture won't have cleared water. I'll have breakfast ready when you come back. He nodded. He was about to go when he stopped. He turned back. He said, about what I said at the creek. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. The particular firmness of a man finishing what he started. I meant it. I wanted to say that plainly, in daylight. Without he stopped, turned the coffee cup once in his hands. I've been thinking about things differently lately, since you came, and I don't know entirely what that means yet, but I wanted you to know that it's true. Maggie held her coffee cup. She thought of 7 women in 2 years. She thought of a 6-year-old with a plan. She thought of 2 years of carefully maintained distance, and a man who still couldn't go into the study to open his dead wife's ledger, but who managed to say, I've been thinking about things differently, in a kitchen at dawn while the snow settled the world outside. I hear you, she said. Not I feel the same way, not where does this go. Just, I hear you. Because that was what the moment required, not more, not less. Just the acknowledgement that the words had been received by someone who understood the effort they'd cost. He nodded. He went out to the cattle. Maggie turned back to the window. The snow had covered the garden, but not erased it. She could still see the careful order of it beneath the white, the staked beds, the patient outlines of what had been planted and would, when spring came, come back. It was all still there, just waiting for the right season. She went to start breakfast. She cracked 8 eggs into the bowl and was 3 strokes into beating them when she heard Mabel's footsteps at the top of the stairs, and then the particular sound of a 6-year-old not quite managing to conceal her hurry. And then Mabel appeared in the kitchen doorway with her hair loose and her eyes bright. It snowed, she said. It snowed, Maggie confirmed. Mabel went directly to the window and pressed both hands against the cold glass and looked out at the white yard with an expression of pure, uncomplicated pleasure that had no calculation in it at all, just a child at a window, and winter, and the world looking clean. Maggie watched her for a moment. She thought, here, whatever the word was for the thing growing in her chest, whatever name it eventually required, it was here, in this kitchen, in this light, with this child at this window. She went back to the eggs. When you're done looking, she said, come wash your hands. You're helping with biscuits. Mabel's reflection in the cold glass was smiling. I know, she said. I always help with biscuits. The snow held for 4 days, then melted to mud, then froze again at the edges of everything: the pump, the fence posts, the lip of the water trough, in the particular halfway state that early Kansas winter did best, never fully committing to either cold or thaw, keeping the ranch in a state of managed difficulty that required constant small adjustments. Maggie adjusted. She'd always been better at the practical than the philosophical, which was perhaps why she didn't spend much time analyzing what Elias had said in the kitchen at dawn. He'd said it, she'd heard it. The days continued requiring what they required, and she continued providing it. And underneath all of that, something was shifting in the household, the way ground shifts in spring, slowly, invisibly, and then all at once in places you weren't watching. Elias started talking at supper. Not extensively, he was never going to be a man who filled a room with conversation, and she'd stopped expecting that sometime in the second week. But he began saying things that weren't strictly necessary. He'd mentioned something that happened in the north pasture, not a problem requiring her input, just a thing that had happened, offered the way you offer something to a person you assume is interested. He asked her once about the boarding house accounts, whether she'd handled them directly or through her mother, and when she said directly, he asked a follow-up question, which was so unlike the Elias of September that Caleb noticed it and exchanged a glance with Jonas that he clearly hoped no one saw. Mabel saw it. Mabel saw everything. She filed it with the rest. The household finances were the thing that brought it to a point. Maggie had been keeping the kitchen ledger since her second week, a habit too ingrained to set aside, and in late November, she'd started noticing discrepancies that weren't in her domain but were impossible to ignore once she'd seen them. The feed merchant in Dodge City was charging Elias a rate that didn't match what the same merchant charged other ranches of comparable size. She knew because Caleb had mentioned the Hennessy operation's feed costs in passing, and the numbers didn't square. She thought about it for 4 days before saying anything. She wasn't sure it was her place. She was a cook. The ranch finances were not her business, any more than Evelyn's ledger had been her business. And she'd already stepped into that territory once, however gently it had landed. But the difference between what Elias was paying and what he should have been paying over the course of a year was substantial, enough to matter. She brought it up on a Tuesday evening after Mabel was in bed, which was becoming, without either of them naming it, the time when she and Elias spoke about things that required a quieter house. She set her calculations on the kitchen table, 2 columns, clear figures, the discrepancy underlined once. He looked at the paper, then at her. "You worked this out from what Caleb said? And from the receipts in the kitchen drawer. You've been keeping them for 2 years, which is good." She pushed the paper slightly toward him. "You've been paying about 14% above market rate. The merchant's name is Purcell since my father's time," Elias said. Something in his face had gone flat in the way it went when he was managing an anger he wasn't sure what to do with yet. "He may have adjusted prices gradually enough that it wasn't obvious year to year," she said. "It's not uncommon. It's not honest, but it's common." He looked at the figures again, pressed his thumb along the edge of the paper. "How long have you been running these numbers?" "About 3 weeks." He looked up. "You've been doing this for 3 weeks. I was making sure I was right before I said anything." He sat with that for a moment, then, "I would have caught it eventually." "You might have," she said. "You're managing a lot of things." She said it without any edge in it, and he heard it that way, not as an excuse she was making for him, just a fact she was stating. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What would you do?" "Write to Purcell, reference the market rate. Give him the opportunity to adjust. If he doesn't, take the business to Callahan's in Cimarron." She paused. "Callahan owes Jonas a favor." Jonas mentioned it once. Elias looked at her with an expression she was getting better at reading, the one where he was thinking something specific that he hadn't decided yet whether to say. Then he said, "Would you write the letter?" She hadn't expected that. "It should come from you," she said. "It should come from someone who knows how to write it without making a man defensive enough to dig in." He held her gaze. "That's not a skill I have, you know that." She did know that. She'd read enough of his terse, functional correspondence, the notes to the bank, the one letter to the Cattlemen's Association. She'd helped him draft to understand that he communicated in the written word the way he communicated in conversation, accurately, minimally, and with the kind of bluntness that got results in half the situations and antagonized people in the other half. "I'll draft it," she said. "You read it before it goes." He nodded. That was, she had come to understand, his version of thank you when the thing being thanked was something he hadn't known he needed. She wrote the letter the next morning. He read it that afternoon, made one change of single words, swapped from something diplomatic to something more direct, which she thought was actually an improvement, and it went out with the mail rider on Thursday. Purcell wrote back inside, 10 days offering a corrected rate and expressing his sincere apologies for any miscommunication, which Caleb read aloud with cheerful skepticism, and Jonas received with his customary silence, and an expression that said he had suspected Purcell for some years. Elias showed her the response without comment. She read it, set it down, went back to the bread she was making. He stood there for a moment. "You have a head for this," he said. "My mother ran a business for 30 years, Maggie said. I was her bookkeeper from the time I was 15. You never said that. You never asked." He registered that she saw it register, the particular stillness of a man understanding something about himself from a sideways angle. He hadn't asked. In 3 months at this ranch, he had never asked her a direct question about her life, her history, her capabilities beyond the ones he'd needed the day she arrived. "What else don't I know?" he said. It wasn't quite a joke. It wasn't quite not one. She looked at him over her shoulder. "You know where to start if you want to find out." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he went out to the barn, and she turned back to her bread, and she was smiling at the dough in a way she was glad no one was there to see. December arrived in 2 stages. First the cold, which was serious and settled, and then the quiet, which was its own kind of weather. The short days concentrated the household inside itself. Caleb and Jonas came in for meals and went to the bunkhouse earlier in the evenings. Mabel, with the school term paused until the new year, spent her days in a sprawling domestic orbit between the kitchen, the upstairs landing, and the parlor, where she had commandeered one corner of the settee for a project involving a collection of pressed flowers that she was arranging between sheets of wax paper with the absorbed focus of a scientist. She'd found the flowers in a box in the study. Elias had been the one to find her there late one afternoon, sitting on the floor with the box open and several dried stems laid out in front of her. He'd stood in the doorway, and Maggie had come up behind him, not knowing what she'd find, and they'd both seen it at the same moment. Mabel, cross-legged on the study floor, holding a dried stem of something pale blue larkspur, Maggie thought with the careful, almost reverent attention of a child, handling something she knew was important. She looked up when she heard them. These were Mama's, she said. Not a question, not quite a confession either, just naming a thing. From the garden, Elias said. His voice was even. He'd gotten better at even. She pressed them every summer, kept them in that box. Mabel looked at the stem in her hand. Can I use some of them for my project? Something crossed his face, a quick, involuntary tightening, and then he looked at the box and the dried flowers and his daughter's careful hands, and he said, she'd like that, using them. Mabel nodded once with the solemnity of an agreement reached. She went back to her arranging. Elias turned and walked down the hall to the kitchen, and Maggie followed, and he stood at the stove with his back to the room for a moment. He's getting better, Mabel told Maggie the next morning. On the stool, with the certainty of her assessments, he used to not be able to go into the study at all. Now he goes in sometimes. I've seen him. People work through things at their own pace, Maggie said. Is it working through? Mabel considered this. It looks more like carrying it differently. Like it's the same weight, but you find a better way to hold it. Maggie looked at the child. That might be the same thing, she said. Mabel shrugged. Maybe. The letter from Dodge City arrived on a Wednesday, and it was addressed to Maggie. She didn't get much mail. The occasional note from a woman she'd known through the boarding house. One stiff letter from the bank's man finalizing the last of her parents' affairs. She recognized the handwriting on this one immediately and felt something tighten in her chest before she'd even opened it. It was from Ruth Calloway, the wife of a dry goods merchant she'd known for years, a woman who'd always been pleasant to her face and whose actual opinion of Maggie she'd never been entirely certain about. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first was pleasantries. The second was local news who had married, who had opened a new business on 2nd Avenue, the usual circulation of information that small towns ran on. The third paragraph was the one Ruth had written the letter for. I happened to be speaking with Clara Hofstede last week at the Women's Auxiliary meeting, and your name came up. Clara mentioned that you'd found a position out on some ranch south of town, cooking and keeping house for a widower. She seemed to find this somewhat amusing, you know how Clara can be, and made some remarks I won't repeat in full, though I'm sure you can guess their nature. I thought you should know, since these things have a way of traveling, and I wouldn't want you to be caught unaware if the talk reaches you. Maggie read the paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter, tucked it into her apron pocket, and went back to the pie crust she'd been making. She knew exactly what Clara Hofstede had said. The remarks Ruth wouldn't repeat in full were not difficult to reconstruct. A large woman, alone, hired by a widower, living in his house. Clara Hofstede could build a considerable amount of implication out of that structure, and she would have done it with the particular pleasure of a woman who considered herself a keeper of standards. The pie crust needed more water, she added it carefully. She thought about what the remarks would be saying about her. She thought about the fact that she'd imagined, somewhere in the back of her mind, that leaving Dodge City had put some distance between herself and that particular variety of judgment. She'd been wrong. Distance wasn't the issue. The issue was that some people carried their opinions the way other people carried tools always available, always ready to be used. She thought about Mabel pressing flowers in the parlor. She thought about Elias saying, "You have a head for this," at the kitchen table. She crimped the edge of the pie crust, set it aside, started on the filling. She did not take the letter out again. When Elias came in that evening, she was finishing supper, and she was going to say nothing. It was not his problem. It was her problem, and she'd handled her own problems for long enough that she wasn't inclined to start distributing them. But he looked at her in the way he'd been developing lately, the look of a man who was actually paying attention, and he said, "What's wrong?" Not a question. He'd learned her face the way she'd learned his. She thought for a moment. Then she took the letter from her apron pocket and set it on the table. He read it. He read the whole thing, which took longer than she expected, and when he was done, he folded it in exactly the same way she had and set it down. He said, "Clara Hofstede. She turned down my application in September. For a kitchen manager position, her loss," he said. Flatly, without elaboration, the way he said things, he meant completely. Maggie looked at him. "The talk will travel. Things like that move from Dodge City to the surrounding ranches in a month, maybe less. I wanted you to know before it got here." Why? She blinked. "Because it may be uncomfortable for you. People make assumptions about everything," he said. "I've been listening to assumptions about this ranch and this family for 2 years. He picked up his coffee. "What Clara Hofstede says in a church auxiliary meeting is not something I'm going to organize my household around. It could affect your reputation with the Cattlemen's Association." With Maggie, he said her name, just her name, quiet and direct. She stopped. He looked at her over the coffee cup. I know what my reputation rests on. It rests on whether my cattle are healthy and my fences are sound and my word is worth something when I give it, not on what a woman in Dodge City thinks about my domestic arrangements. He set the cup down. If someone brings it to me, I'll tell them exactly what I think of the question. That should settle it. She was quiet for a moment. You're not worried, she said. I'm not worried. She looked at the letter on the table. I am, she said, because it was honest and she'd promised herself a long time ago not to perform equanimity she didn't feel. I'm not worried about my position here. She stopped, found the right words. I've spent my whole life being the subject of that kind of talk. From people who decided what I was before they knew anything about me. And I had hoped. She stopped again. It doesn't matter. It matters, he said. Say it. She looked at him. He was watching her, with the focused attention he brought to things he'd decided were worth his full concentration. And she understood that he wasn't going to look away. And she was tired, suddenly, of managing things alone. I had hoped, she said, that out here it would be different. That the work would be enough. That what I could do would matter more than what I looked like. She paused. Foolish. Not foolish, he said. True, it is different out here. And the work is enough. He was quiet for a moment. I see what you can do. I have seen it since the first week. Anyone looking at this household sees it. He paused. Clara Hofstede is not someone whose opinion I'd take on any subject. I wouldn't take her opinion on flour, let alone on you. Maggie laughed. It surprised her came out before she'd decided to do it. And it surprised him, too. She could see it. And then the corner of his mouth moved in that barely their way. She picked up the letter and set it aside. They ate supper that evening, with Mabel between them at the table. The pressed flowers laid out on the sideboard where Mabel had placed them to show Maggie after the meal. And Caleb talked too much about the weather. And Jonas finished everything on his plate, and the kitchen was warm. Christmas preparations began the way most things began at the Rourke Ranch, practically without ceremony. There was a tree to cut. Elias did that with Caleb on the 22nd, dragging in a cedar from the east slope that shed immediately on the parlor floor and listed slightly to the left, which Mabel regarded with the expression of someone reassessing a situation. She spent an hour propping it more securely with 2 wedges of wood, which worked adequately. There were decorations, a box from the back of the closet that Elias brought down without comment and set on the parlor floor and left for Mabel to open. She did it the way she did everything, careful, slowly, one item at a time. Strings of dried berries, a few glass ornaments packed in cloth, a paper star that had been repaired twice with careful folds. She hung everything without rushing, and she let Maggie help with the higher branches, and she told the story of each ornament in the particular tone of a child whose memories of these objects were old enough to be important and recent enough to still be tender. There was one ornament she set aside without hanging. Maggie saw it but didn't ask. It was a small carved wooden bird, a wren, she thought, or something like one, and Mabel held it for a moment and then put it back in the box on top, where it could be seen but wasn't on the tree. Later, when Elias came to see the result and stood in the parlor doorway looking at the lopsided cedar with its strings of berries and its careful ornaments, Mabel pointed out the box with the bird on top. I left that one, she said. I didn't know if you wanted to hang it. He looked at it. She made that, he said. Your mother. The winter before you were born. He was quiet for a moment. She made it for the baby. She didn't know yet if you'd be a boy or a girl. Mabel looked at the bird. Why a wren, she said. Wrens were the most practical birds. Small, built good nests, survived everything. He looked at his daughter with the kind of look a parent gets when they suddenly see the whole span of a person's life at once. She was right, as it turned out. Mabel picked up the bird and turned it over in her fingers. Then she got up from the floor, went to the tree, and hung it on the highest branch she could reach, which wasn't quite high enough. And she turned to Maggie. Maggie lifted her the rest of the way. The bird went on the highest branch. Elias stood in the doorway watching, and Maggie didn't look at him. But she felt him there the way you feel a change in the air before weather shifts, and she concentrated on setting Mabel back on her feet and not thinking too carefully about anything beyond that. Christmas Eve was cold in the particular final way of December, a settled, decided cold that had made its choice and wasn't reconsidering. Caleb went to his sister's in Dodge City, which he'd been talking about for 2 weeks, with the excitement of a young man who had been in the country too long. Jonas stayed in the bunkhouse as he always did, claiming no interest in celebration, and probably meaning it, though Maggie had left a plate at his door since her second week at the ranch, and he'd never once left anything on it. Mabel fell asleep in the parlor beside the tree at 8:30, the way children do on significant evenings by complete sudden collapse, mid-sentence, as though the anticipation had finally emptied her out. Elias carried her upstairs with the practiced ease of a man who'd been doing this for 6 years, and Maggie heard him moving around up there, the soft sounds of boots set down carefully. of a door drawn nearly shut. She was at the kitchen table when he came back down. She had a cup of tea and the last of the mending there, was always mending, and the lamp turned low because the kitchen was warm enough and the lower light was easier on the eyes. He came in and stood for a moment. He'd taken off his boots on the stairs and he was in his socks, which made him look unexpectedly ordinary. And he looked at the kitchen the way he sometimes did now, as if he were checking whether it was still what he thought it was. "She's out," he said, "I heard." He sat down across from her. Not at the head of the table, where he usually sat for meals, but across the chair Mabel used. He put his hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. "I want to tell you something," he said. She set down her mending. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man organizing something he's carried for a while and has finally decided to put down. "When Evelyn died," he said, "I thought I understood what that was going to mean. I thought I'd grieve, and it would pass the way things pass, and then I'd figure out the next part." He paused. "That's not what happened. What happened was I got stuck. Not I wasn't unable to function. I was functional. I ran the ranch, I took care of Mabel, I did what needed doing." He looked up. "But I stopped expecting anything. From the days. Stopped thinking there was a next part that was worth looking for." He held her gaze steadily, the way it cost him to hold things steadily. "And then you came." Maggie was very still. "You didn't try to fix anything," he said. "You didn't try to replace anything. You came in and you made the bread and you braided her hair and you sorted out the pantry and you found the problem with Purcell's pricing and you sat in the kitchen at 10 o'clock at night with my daughter who couldn't sleep and you didn't make any of it into something it wasn't." He stopped, pressed on. "I noticed every single one of those things. I want you to know that." She said nothing. She was waiting because he hadn't reached it yet. "I've been trying to figure out what the words are," he said, "for a while now, and I don't think I have all of them. I probably won't have all of them for a long time because that's not—" He gestured, a small frustrated movement. "That's not how I work. You know that." "I know that," she said. "But I know this." He took a breath. "I love you. That word, I know what it costs and I know what it means, and I'm not saying it because it's Christmas Eve and the sentiment seems appropriate. I'm saying it because it's been true for a while and I've been a coward about it." He looked at her with complete steadiness. "And I know that you came here as an employee. I know that I've never given you a reason to think I was going to. I know this might not be what you want. I know you might have your own plans, your own—" "Elias," she said. He stopped. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. She'd never done that. In 3.5 months at this ranch, she had been careful about proximity, about what she initiated, because she was a woman in a position where the power was not equal, and she was not foolish about what that meant. But she put her hand over his now, and she felt him go very still. "I know what it costs," she said, "for you to say that. I'm not going to make you wait to find out where I stand." She looked at him at the tired, complicated, trying face of a man who had been carrying a very large thing and had just set part of it down. "I love this house. I love that child upstairs. And I love the man who has spent 3 months pretending to forget his gloves." She saw something move in his face. "I'm not going anywhere. Not unless you tell me to go." He turned his hand under hers and held it. They sat like that in the quiet kitchen, the lamp low. The cold settled hard against the windows, the house breathing around them. Not the silence of two people who had nothing to say, the silence of two people who had said the necessary thing and didn't need to cover it with anything else. Then from upstairs, with the extraordinary timing of a child who had been impersonating sleep, a creak of floorboards. A very deliberate creak. The kind produced by someone who has moved to the top of the stairs and is listening at the railing. Then Mabel's voice, hushed but carrying with the precision of a stage whisper aimed at a specific audience. "Is she saying yes?" Elias closed his eyes briefly. He had the expression of a man who had suspected this was possible and had not adequately prepared. Maggie said, "To the ceiling. Go to bed, Mabel." A pause. "But is she saying yes?" "Mabel Rourke," Elias said with the firmness of a father who is also trying very hard not to laugh. "That's not an answer," Mabel said, though the creak of floorboards reversed direction, and there was the sound of small feet retreating with dignity toward their room. Maggie looked at Elias. He was looking at her with something in his face that she hadn't seen before, not the guarded, careful look, not the functional look, not even the barely there smile look. Something open, something that had been in there all along, waiting for the structure around it to come down enough to be visible. "She's been awake this whole time," he said. "Of course she has," Maggie said. He shook his head once, slowly, in the way of a man whose 6-year-old has outmaneuvered him repeatedly for months and has not yet stopped. "She planned this. She plans everything," Maggie said. "She gets it from somewhere." He looked at their hands on the table. He turned hers over and looked at it rough in the places a working woman's hands were rough. The knuckle on her right forefinger where she'd caught it on the bread pan 2 weeks ago, and it had scabbed and almost healed. He looked at her hand the way he looked at things he was deciding were worth his full attention. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not performance, not preamble. Just the words. She'd known for weeks, in the way you know things you haven't let yourself name, that this was coming. And knowing it in advance did not, she discovered, make the moment of it any less than it was. Because this man, this complicated, reticent, trying man who came inside to collect gloves he hadn't left and said this is good with the gravity of a significant declaration, was asking her to build a life with him in a place she had already made her own. And she had spent 27 years being told that a woman who looked like her didn't get to have this. Yes, she said. From upstairs came the very clearly audible sound of Mabel Rourke attempting to contain herself and failing, which manifested as a sound somewhere between a squeak and a suppressed shout, followed by the rapid percussion of small feet running back to their room, followed by silence. Elias pressed his mouth together. It didn't hold. He laughed, really laughed, the way he had at the dinner table over the corn, but longer this time and less surprised, as if the muscle was coming back more easily now. He pressed his hand over his eyes. "I should go tell her to sleep," he said. "She won't sleep," Maggie said. "I know," he stood. He looked at her from the other side of the table. She was still sitting. Her tea gone cold, the mending forgotten, the lamp low, and the kitchen warm around them. He looked at her the way the morning looked at the east window, like something that had come up specifically. Maggie said. "Go tell her," she said. He went upstairs. She listened to the sound of his knock on Mabel's door, the immediate explosion of Mabel's voice, not words she could make out, just the quality of a child releasing something held too long, and Elias's voice lower, steadier, and then the two of them talking in the way they talked when it was just them in the house. She sat in the kitchen and listened to the sound of the family upstairs, and she thought about a woman in a cold boarding house room in September with a folded newspaper advertisement and a carpet bag packed badly. She thought about arriving at a door and knocking. She thought about being chosen before she knew she was being considered. The lamp burned low. She trimmed it, built the fire up slightly for the night, set the kitchen in order. She was who she was, large and practical and unbeautiful by the measures Clara Hofstede used, unglamorous by Vivian Mercer's calculus, too much for every place that had turned her away. She was exactly enough for this one. She went upstairs. Mabel's door was still half open, the light inside still on. She paused at the door and looked in. Elias sitting on the edge of the bed, Mabel sitting up against her pillow with her hair loose and her eyes bright, talking with her hands in the rapid, emphatic way she did when something mattered to her. She was saying something about the flower garden in spring and whether Maggie would help replant the larkspur, and Elias was listening with the full attention he'd been learning to give things again. Neither of them had seen her. She didn't interrupt. She went to her room, the room with the sealed window and the east-facing glass, and she got ready for bed. And she lay in the dark and listened to the murmur of voices down the hall until they stopped. And then the quiet of the house was just a house being quiet. Nothing wrong in it. Nothing haunted. She was still awake when the snow started. She could tell by the change in the quality of the silence outside. Snow had a particular way of absorbing sound, making the world smaller and more immediate, pulling the walls of a house in close around the people inside it. She lay in the dark and listened to it settle. She thought, this is what it feels like. Not triumph, not rescue. Something more durable than either the specific ordinary weight of belonging somewhere, of having arrived finally in the right place at the right time with the right people, not because life had been generous with her, but because she had kept going long enough to find it. The snow fell. The house held. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't lie awake calculating what came next. They married on a Saturday in January, which was Mabel's idea. She had presented the case for Saturday with the methodical precision of a child who had been thinking about it longer than anyone knew. Saturday meant Caleb wouldn't have to choose between the wedding and a work day, which mattered because Caleb had been at the ranch since before Mabel could walk, and leaving him out was not something she was willing to consider. Saturdays also meant Jonas would come inside, because Jonas came inside on Saturdays for the noon meal and could be persuaded to stay if the occasion was significant enough, and Mabel had already determined that it was. She'd laid all of this out at breakfast on the 27th of December with the air of a woman presenting a business proposal, and Elias had looked at Maggie over his coffee cup, and Maggie had said Saturday was fine, and that had been the extent of the wedding planning discussion. The rest of it Maggie handled herself in the practical way she handled everything. She wrote to a woman she'd known in Dodge City, not Ruth Calloway, not anyone connected to Clara Hofstede's circle, but a dressmaker named Petra Voss, who had altered a dress for her mother years ago and had done it without commentary, which was rarer than it should have been. She explained what she needed, something in a dark blue wool, fitted but not restrictive, that could be worn again for ordinary occasions and wouldn't look absurd on a working ranch. Petra wrote back with measurements requested and a price that was fair, and the dress arrived on the 3rd of January wrapped in brown paper and was exactly what Maggie had asked. For not beautiful in the way of things designed purely to be looked at, but good, solid, suited to the woman who would be wearing it. Mabel inspected it with the focused attention she brought to all important assessments. She circled it twice while Maggie held it against herself. "It's the right color," Mabel said finally. "I thought so. Blue is a serious color." She touched the sleeve. "Mama wore blue at her wedding too, Papa told me." Maggie looked at the girl. "Is that all right?" Mabel considers it. "I think so. Blue is blue. It doesn't belong to any one person." She stepped back. "You look like yourself in it. That's what matters." This was, Maggie thought, the most useful thing anyone had ever said to her about clothing. The morning of the wedding was cold, with a pale sun that came and went behind high clouds without committing to either warmth or gray. Jonas shoveled the porch without being asked. Caleb appeared at the kitchen door an hour early and asked 3 separate times if there was anything he could do, which there wasn't. So Maggie put him to work splitting kindling, because it gave him somewhere to put his energy. The ceremony was in the parlor, because the parlor was where the cedar tree still stood and where Mabel had hung the wren ornament on the highest branch, and because neither Maggie nor Elias had any interest in making the 12-mile trip to Dodge City for the benefit of an audience they hadn't invited. The justice of the peace was a man named Harold Briggs, who came out from town in a wagon and was red-nosed from the cold and very brief about the legal portion of the proceedings, which suited everyone present. He'd done this enough times that he moved through it without ceremony and without sentimentality, which was also fine. Some things didn't need ornamentation. Mabel stood beside Maggie, holding a bunch of dried lavender from Evelyn's garden, which she had located, dried and tied with a piece of blue ribbon over the preceding 2 weeks, with careful deliberateness. She'd said nothing about it until she pressed it into Maggie's hands that morning, with the manner of someone completing a task they'd planned for some time. Elias stood across from Maggie in his good jacket dark wool, brushed clean, the one he wore to Cattlemen's Association meetings, and had not, she suspected, worn for anything personal in some years. He'd shaved carefully. There was a small cut near his jaw where the razor had slipped, which she noticed, and which made her feel a tenderness she hadn't expected, because it was such a human thing, a man nervous enough to cut himself shaving on his own wedding morning. When Harold Briggs got to the relevant part, Elias said "I do" in the same voice. He said everything that mattered, quiet, direct, no room for doubt in it. Maggie said it back. Caleb, who was standing near the doorway, made a sound that he immediately converted into a cough. Jonas stood with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable, which was Jonas's version of being moved. Mabel did not bother concealing anything. She stood beside Maggie with the lavender in both hands and her face entirely open, and when Harold Briggs said the concluding words and it was done, she looked from Maggie to her father and then back and said, with the calm certainty of someone confirming a calculation they'd been running for months, "Good." Just that one word. Elias looked at his daughter. Something in his face shifted, not grief, not its absence either, but the complicated country between them where people live when they've loved and lost, and found the courage to love again. He reached out and put his hand on the top of Mabel's head, and she leaned against his arm, and Maggie stood in the parlor of the Rourke Ranch with dried lavender in her hands and thought, "This is what I came for, though I didn't know it when I left." The first months of the marriage were not effortless, 'cause nothing real ever is. Elias was a man with habits built over decades of solitude and work, and marriage required adjustments that he made earnestly and imperfectly. He forgot occasionally that decisions about the household now included Maggie's opinion by right, rather than courtesy. He retreated into himself sometimes when things went wrong at the ranch, and she had to learn the difference between the silence that wanted company and the silence that needed space, which was not always obvious from the outside, and which she got wrong more than once in the first months. She had her own failures. She was not a patient woman by nature. She'd always moved at a pace that other people found slightly pressuring. And there were evenings when she pushed conversations that Elias wasn't ready to have, and then had to back out of them with the gracelessness of someone who has charged into a room and discovered it wasn't the room they needed. She had opinions about the ranch finances that were correct, and that she sometimes delivered with a bluntness that landed harder than she'd intended. And she and Elias had 2 real arguments in the first 3 months' actual arguments, voices raised in the kitchen with Mabel pointedly not present, and both of them went to bed angry, and woke up having processed enough of it to continue. Neither argument broke anything essential. What she discovered in those early months was that a marriage between 2 people who have both survived a great deal is different from the marriages she'd observed in her parents' boarding house, those early life unions where the 2 people were, still becoming themselves inside the relationship. She and Elias were already formed. The friction was real. So was the foundation, and the foundation was more substantial than the friction, though it didn't always feel that way in the moment. Mabel navigated the adjusted household with her characteristic combination of perception and practicality. She gave them space when they needed it, and she appeared in the kitchen on difficult evenings with some reasonable excuse to be there, which was her way of making sure no one was alone with something too heavy. And neither Maggie nor Elias ever pointed this out, because pointing it out would have embarrassed her, and the kindness of what she was doing mattered more than whether she knew they'd noticed. Spring came, and with it the garden. The flower beds had survived the winter in the patient way of established plants' roots still viable under the frozen ground, waiting for the temperature to shift. Maggie went out in the first week of March to assess, when the mud was still heavy and the air still had cold in it, and she stood at the edge of the beds and looked at what was there. Some of it was beyond saving. 2 years of neglect and one hard winter had taken the most delicate things. But the core of it, the larkspur, the coneflower, the tough old roses along the south fence had held. Mabel came to stand beside her. "What do you think?" she said. "I think most of it is still there," Maggie said. "It needs work. Probably 2 seasons to come back fully. But it will come back. The bones of it will fill in what's missing." Mabel crouched at the edge of the nearest bed and pressed her fingers into the cold soil. "Mama planted the roses the year she and Papa moved here. Before I was born, she looked at the bare canes along the fence. I used to help her deadhead them in July. She'd lift me up to get the high ones." Maggie looked at the roses. They were old enough and established enough that the root systems were probably still strong. With work and time, they'd come back as vigorously as anything in the garden. "Then we'll start with the roses," she said. They spent 3 Saturdays in March and April on the garden, Maggie, Mabel, and occasionally Elias, who pruned the roses with the focused attention of a man doing something that mattered beyond the task itself and didn't need to say so. Caleb turned the soil in the beds that needed it. Jonas appeared one afternoon with a load of composted manure from the barn and deposited it at the garden's edge without comment, which was as close to enthusiasm as Jonas ever expressed for anything that wasn't cattle. By May, the larkspur was coming up. Mabel knelt beside the emerging shoots with an expression Maggie recognized from the morning they'd spent pressing flowers in December, the careful, almost reverent attention of someone in the presence of something that connects the present to a past they're still working out how to carry. "She'd like this," Mabel said. "I think so too," Maggie said. Mabel sat back on her heels. "Does it bother you when I talk about her?" "No." Maggie settled onto the low garden stool she'd started keeping there for these sessions. "Why would it? Some people find it strange. Talking about someone who isn't here like they still matter." "They still matter," Maggie said simply. "That doesn't stop." She looked at the larkspur. "Your mother planned this garden knowing she might not always be here to tend it. That's not a sad thing. That's a woman who understood that what she built would outlast her." Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you going to plant something of your own? In the garden?" Maggie hadn't thought about it in those explicit terms, though the question had been forming somewhere at the back of her mind. "What do you think should go in?" "I think there should be something practical," Mabel said with complete seriousness. "Something useful. That's more you than flowers." Maggie laughed. "Herbs, then. Along the south edge where it gets the most afternoon sun." "Lavender," Mabel said. "We used the last of Mama's for your wedding bouquet." "We should grow more lavender, it is," Maggie said. They ordered the starts from the seed catalog that same week. The ranch changed over that first year of marriage in ways that were partly Maggie's doing, and partly the natural result of a household that had been running at minimum capacity for 2 years finally operating at full strength. She took over the accounts completely by February, with Elias's full sanction, and after the initial awkwardness of a man who associated control of the finances with competence and had to reckon with the fact that her competence exceeded his in this particular area, his genuine relief. She identified 2 more suppliers who were overcharging, renegotiated both contracts, and redirected the savings into repairs the ranch had needed. For over a year, the barn roof, the water trough in the north pasture, the broken window in the bunkhouse that Jonas had been tolerating with the stoic forbearance of a man who expected discomfort as a matter of principle. She began keeping track of the cattle numbers herself, cross-referencing with Elias, building a picture of the herd's health and productivity over time that allowed them to make selling decisions with more precision than Elias had managed on instinct alone. His instinct was good, she said so, and meant it, but instinct and data together were better than either alone. By the summer, they were expanding the cattle operation. By fall, the ranch was carrying 50 more head than it had in 3 years, and the new water trough in the north pasture had solved a grazing problem that had been costing them quietly for longer than anyone had calculated. At the October meeting of the Cattlemen's Association, Elias was asked twice about his management approach. He said both times that he'd had help with the numbers. He said it without qualification and without false modesty. And the second man who asked a rancher named Whitfield from the Eastern Valley, who was the type to find things slightly amusing that he'd been given to understand were amusing, looked at him for a moment, and then at Maggie, who was standing nearby, and apparently recalculated something. He tipped his hat to her before he left. Small thing. She noticed it. Clara Hofstede's remarks had traveled as Ruth's letter had predicted they would, and Maggie had encountered the residue of them twice in her first months at the ranch, once from a woman in town who had asked, with the particular precision of false innocence, whether she found it difficult keeping house for a man with a young daughter, and once from a rancher's wife at a community dinner who had looked at her for a long moment before deciding to sit elsewhere. These things happened. She handled them the way she'd always handled them, by continuing to be exactly who she was, consistently and without apology, until the people around her either updated their opinions or became irrelevant to her daily life. Most of them updated. The ones who didn't, she didn't have to see often, and Kansas was large enough that not seeing people you didn't need to see was achievable with minimal effort. What surprised her was not the acceptance that came, slowly, from the community around the ranch. What surprised her was the moment she realized she had stopped waiting for it. It was a Tuesday in August, ordinary in every respect. She was at the kitchen table with the account books and a cup of cold coffee she'd forgotten to drink while it was warm, and Elias was in the barn, and Mabel was at Mrs. Hadley's, and the house was quiet. She looked up from the numbers and looked at the kitchen around her, the organized shelves, the dried herbs hanging near the window, the stool at the work table that had Mabel's particular dent in the seat from 6 years of use, and she thought, I live here, not as a reckoning, not with surprise, just as a fact that had quietly become so settled that she could think it plainly. She went back to the account books. Mabel turned 7 in April, 8 in the April after that, and each year she grew in the direction she'd always been growing outward, more of herself, sharper in her opinions and more confident in her assessments, the way certain plants grow when they finally have enough soil. She was 9 when Maggie's first pregnancy became undeniable, which Mabel apparently already knew before Maggie said anything, because she appeared in the kitchen doorway. The evening Maggie finally sat Elias down to tell him and said, from the doorway, without being addressed, I know. I've known for 3 weeks. Elias looked at her. How? You get quieter when you're thinking about something you're not ready to say, Mabel said to Maggie. You've been quieter for 3 weeks. She leaned against the doorframe. Is it going to be a boy or a girl? We won't know that for a while, Maggie said. I'd like a sister, Mabel said. I've thought about it, and a sister makes more sense. She straightened. But I'll accept a brother if that's what happens. She went back upstairs. Elias looked at Maggie. Maggie looked at Elias. She's 9, he said. She's been 9 since April, Maggie said. This isn't new. He shook his head slowly. Then he took Maggie's hand across the table, in the way he'd been doing at supper since December, and he held it. Are you all right? He said. Are you? He paused. This is different from what you expected when you answered the advertisement. This wasn't, she said. Yes, this is exactly what I expected. I just didn't know it yet. He looked at her hand in his. He turned it over as he'd done on Christmas Eve, looking at the rough places and the healed knuckle and the ink stains from the account books. He looked at it with the full attention of a man taking inventory of something he intended to keep. Okay, he said. The baby was a girl. Mabel received this news with the vindication of someone whose analysis had been confirmed by evidence. They named her Clara Jane for Maggie's mother. Clara for no particular reason, except that Elias had a grandmother by that name, who had been by all accounts formidable, and Maggie found she had no strong feelings about Clara as a name now that it was attached to something better than Clara Hofstede. 2 years later, a boy, they named him Thomas, and the year after that, in the summer when the larkspur was at its fullest, and the roses along the south fence were the best they'd been, since Evelyn planted them another girl, small and loud and certain about her needs from the first moment, who they named Ruth, after the woman who had written Maggie a letter in November and thought she deserved to know what was being said about her. The ranch expanded to accommodate them. Elias added a room to the east side of the house in the spring, after Clara Jane was born. He built it himself, with Cabe's help, and he built it solidly in the way he built everything. And if the window frame was slightly uneven on one side, Maggie cut a piece of flannel for the gap and didn't mention it. Mabel turned 16 in a spring that was damp and slow, and eventually became the most beautiful April the valleys had seen in a decade. The kind of spring that made you understand why people had come to Kansas in the first place and stayed despite everything. She had grown into herself completely by then, tall, particular, direct in the way that had been there at 6, and had only clarified with time. She was at the county school 3 days a week and spent the other days helping with the younger children and the accounts. because she had her mother's organizational instinct and Maggie's head for numbers and was, as Jonas had remarked once with unusual verbosity, the most capable person on the property, and she was 16. On the morning of her birthday, Maggie came to her room. She was carrying the wooden box. Mabel saw it from the bed where she was sitting brushing out her hair, and she went still. The box had been in the study all these years. Maggie had never moved it, had never suggested it be moved. It had stayed on its shelf with the patient presence of something that was waiting for the right moment, and the right moment had not until now arrived. Maggie set it on the bed beside her. "Your father thought you should have had this sooner," Maggie said. "I thought you should have it when you were ready to hold what's in it." She paused. "Neither of us is certain we're right. But you're 16, and that's one of the moments she wrote for." Mabel looked at the box. She put the hairbrush down. She opened it the way she'd opened everything important in her life, slowly, one element at a time, with full attention. The letter for the first day of school she set aside, because that moment was gone and she would read it later. The letter for her wedding day she set aside for the same reason. The letter for her 16th birthday she held in both hands and looked at for a moment before she opened it. Maggie started to rise. "I'll leave you stay," Mabel said. It was quiet and absolute. She read the letter. Maggie watched her face as she read. She had not read the letters. She had seen 6 lines of the first one 3 years ago in the spare room and had put it back. She did not read over Mabel's shoulder now. She simply sat beside her on the bed and was present, which was what she'd been asked to do. When Mabel finished, she folded the letter along its original lines. She held it in her lap. She was quiet for a long time. And she says, she stopped. "Try it again." At the end, she says, "I don't know who will be with you for this birthday, or what your life looks like at 16. But I hope there is someone beside you who loves you the way I love you, and I hope you let them. That is the only thing I'm asking of you from wherever I am. Let them love you. You deserve to be loved." Maggie's throat tightened. Mabel looked at her. Her eyes were bright with contained water. She was her father's daughter in that, managing her face with great effort and imperfect success. "She wrote that before she knew you existed," Mabel said. "Yes, but it's about you." She said it with the certainty of someone who has read something and understood it completely. "She couldn't have known it was about you. But it is." Maggie said nothing for a moment. She thought about Evelyn Rourke, whom she had never met, who had organized her love into envelopes and ledgers and wax-pressed flowers and a carefully worded advertisement in the Dodge City Standard. She thought about what it meant to know something so completely that you could reach forward into a future you wouldn't see and leave the right thing in the right place for the right person. "There's one more," Mabel said. She reached into the box and took out a small envelope Maggie hadn't seen separate from the others, unsealed, smaller. She held it out. Maggie looked at it. "Mabel." "It's addressed to you," Mabel said. Maggie looked again. She had assumed all these years that the box contained only what Elias had described letters to Mabel, for Mabel's milestones. She had never thought to check for anything else. She had never thought it was her place. Her name was on the envelope in Evelyn's careful handwriting. "For the woman who stays." Maggie held it. She looked at it for a long time. Her hands were not entirely steady, which she noticed with the analytical part of her mind and didn't try to manage. She opened it. The letter was 1 page. It was not dated. "I don't know you. I don't know when you'll arrive, or how, or what Mabel will have done to arrange it. Because I know my daughter, and I know she will arrange it somehow. But if you are reading this, then you stayed. You stayed when it was difficult, and you stayed when Elias was impossible, and you stayed when Mabel tested you. Because she will test you. She is mine, and she tests everything she loves. I am not asking you to love them the way I did. That love is mine, and I'm taking it with me. I am asking you to love them the way you do, which will be different and yours, and exactly what they need in a way I cannot provide anymore. I am asking you to let Mabel grieve me and also let her grow past it. Those two things will sometimes feel like they conflict. They don't. I am asking you to be patient with Elias, who will be worse than he was before I got sick, because grief does that to men who don't know how to ask for help. He will come back. He always does. And I am asking you, most of all, to not apologize for being there. You are not a replacement. You are what comes next, which is a different thing entirely. What comes next is necessary. Please don't be sorry for it. Thank you for staying, Rourke." Maggie read it once. She read it again. Then she sat on the edge of Mabel's bed with a letter from a woman she'd never met, written before she'd arrived, addressed to her specifically, and she felt something that she'd been carrying for 3 years, a careful, unnamed weight, the faint residue of the feeling that she was occupying a place that had belonged to someone else, shift and release, cleanly the way a bone sets when it finally returns to its proper alignment. "You are not a replacement. You are what comes next." Mabel was watching her. She knew, Mabel said softly. She always knew there would be someone. She just wrote the letter and waited. She was very organized, Maggie said, which was the only thing she trusted herself to say in that moment. Mabel let out a breath that was half a laugh. You always say that. It's always true. They sat together on the bed, the 16-year-old who had been 6 when she'd decided, and the woman she'd decided on, with the letters between them and the April light coming through the east window, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there wasn't anything else that needed to be said. Then Mabel leaned against Maggie's shoulder the way she'd leaned against her arm on the kitchen stool at 10 o'clock at night. Years ago, when the house had felt wrong and she couldn't sleep with the same complete and unguarded trust, just larger now, the body of a young woman instead of a child, and the weight of it was different, but the meaning was the same. Maggie put her arm around her. They stayed like that until Clara Jane's voice came up the stairs. She was 7 and loud and utterly without patience, which were 3 qualities she shared with her namesake's opposite, demanding to know if there was going to be birthday cake, and if so, whether she could help with the frosting. And Mabel extracted herself from Maggie's arm and called down that there would be cake, and she could not be trusted with the frosting, and to ask Maggie. Maggie's up there with you, Clara Jane called back, with the tone of a child who has identified a flaw in a system. Then wait, Mabel said, and turned back to Maggie with dry eyes now, and her composed face back in place, her father's composure, her mother's precision, and something that was entirely her own. She's going to eat the frosting directly, she said. I know, Maggie said. She does it every time. You should hide it better. I've tried. She's resourceful. Mabel smiled. It was a full smile, not the careful managed smiles of her early childhood, but the real thing, the smile that had been growing in her for 10 years. She gets it from somewhere, she said, which was exactly what Maggie had said to Elias on Christmas Eve, 3 years ago. And Mabel knew it, and was returning it deliberately, and Maggie felt something that was too large to be called ordinary happiness, and too quiet to be called joy, though it was both of those things. She stood up. She straightened her dress. She put Evelyn's letter back in the box, and set the box carefully on Mabel's nightstand, where it would stay from now on. Let's go make a birthday cake, she said. The years settled into themselves the way years do when a life has found its shape. There were bad seasons of drought. The summer Thomas turned 3 that cost them cattle, and required the kind of financial calculation that kept Maggie at the account books until midnight for 2 months running. There was a winter when Clara Jane had a fever that lasted 11 days and aged Maggie in a way she felt in her bones. There was the year the barn roof failed in a storm despite the repairs, and Elias and Caleb rebuilt it in October with the bad-tempered efficiency of men doing necessary work in cold weather and not enjoying it. There was the morning Elias came in from the north pasture and sat down at the kitchen table and said, without preamble, that Jonas had collapsed at the water trough and they needed to get him to town. They got him to town. He came back 3 weeks later, thinner, slower, with a bottle of pills from the doctor that he accepted with the resigned stoicism of a man who has decided that if surviving requires pills, then pills it is, and he went back to work at a pace that was 2/3 of what it had been, and still exceeded Caleb's full effort on most days. There were good seasons, too, the spring, when everything bloomed at once, when the roses came back so fully along the south fence that people coming down the Cimarron Road commented on them, when the larkspur that Maggie had planted the first spring was so established that it seeded itself and spread beyond the original bed in a way that required managing, but that she found each year impossible to cut back as severely as she should. There was the fall Mabel left for a teaching position in the county seat, which was 20 miles away, and might as well have been another country, for the silence it left in the house. She came back every Sunday. On the first Sunday, she didn't come back. The road was bad, and she'd sent word. Elias was short-tempered all day, and Maggie let him be, and in the evening he sat at the kitchen table and said, I know she's fine. She is, Maggie said. She's better than fine. She's exactly where she should be. She is, I know that. He pressed his hands flat on the table. I know, she said. She poured him coffee. She sat down across from him. Outside, Thomas and Clara Jane were audible in the yard, the specific noise of children who have been told to play outside and are making the most of it. The baby Ruth had fallen asleep in the parlor after supper, which happened every evening, and had not yet resulted in her sleeping through the night, a failure that Ruth appeared to regard as optional. Elias looked at the kitchen around him, at the organized shelves and the hanging herbs and the stool at the work table, which was still there even though Mabel hadn't sat on it in months, because no one had thought to move it and no one was going to. I used to think, he said, that what happened to us losing Evelyn was the thing that defined this family, the loss, that it was the center of everything, and everything else arranged itself around it. Maggie waited. It's not, he said. I don't think it's been that for a long time. Maybe since you came. He looked at her across the table. The center is something else now. She looked back at him. At the face she knew completely now, the tiredness in it, the gray at the temples that had arrived without announcement, the cut-jaw steadiness of a man who had rebuilt himself from something broken, and had done it imperfectly and genuinely and without asking for credit. "What is it?" she said. He gestured, a small motion that encompassed the kitchen, the house, the sound of children outside. "This," he said, "just this." She understood him precisely. This was not a romantic statement, not in the way of poetry or speeches. It was the statement of a man who had looked at the full account of his life and found it solvent, who had arrived at a point where the losses were real and present and not erased by anything, but were no longer the only column in the ledger. She reached across the table. He took her hand. There is a thing that happens to people who have been judged harshly and survived it. They develop, over time, a particular kind of vision. They see past the surface of things because they have had to. They understand that what a person carries and what a person shows are not always the same, because they have lived the distance between those two things themselves. Maggie Whitmore Rourke had that vision. She had arrived at the Rourke Ranch with a badly packed carpet bag and 9 days left on a rented room, and she had been chosen by a 6-year-old who understood something about people that most adults spend their whole lives missing. That worth is not located in the surface, that it lives deeper, in the hands and the mind and the stubborn refusal to let the world's opinion become your own. She had never been the woman that other people's criteria required. She was too large by Clara Hofstede's measurements, too plain by Vivian Mercer's calculus, too undecorative by the standards of every establishment that had turned her application over and handed it back. She had known this about herself, with the clear-eyed practicality of a woman who had been dealing with it since childhood, and had chosen, at some point she could not specifically locate, to stop organizing her life around the deficit it created. What she had instead, her mother's rigor and her father's steadiness, and a knowledge of how to run a household and keep accounts and grow lavender from starts, and braid 2 braids to the same tension, and sit in a kitchen at 10 o'clock at night with a child who couldn't. Sleep and simply be present until the world felt less wrong. These turned out to be sufficient, more than sufficient. These turned out to be exactly what was needed in the exact place where she'd been needed, at the exact time, which was a coincidence. She would not call anything more than that because she was a practical woman, and she had no patience for the kind of retroactive storytelling that made everything seem inevitable. It had not been inevitable, it had been possible, and she had made herself available to the possibility by not giving up. That is the thing about lives that look, from the outside, like they are about one dramatic transformation. They are almost never that. They are accumulated days, each one requiring only that you do the next reasonable thing. Wake up, build the fire, make the bread, braid the hair both sides to the same tension. Write the letter that needs to be written. Sit with the person who needs sitting with. Say the true thing when the true thing is required. Hold on. Hold on. She was in the garden the June after Maisel's 16th birthday when she looked up and saw the whole of it, the house, standing solid in the afternoon light. The East Addition Elias had built still slightly uneven at one window, the barn with its repaired roof, the cottonwood by the creek that Mabel had mapped when she was small, and that Thomas was now mapping in his turn. The roses along the south fence in their second decade, blooming better than they had the year before. She looked at the lavender she'd planted 3 years ago, which had spread along the south edge of the garden, in exactly the way lavender does when it's given adequate sun and adequate time. She looked at all of it and thought she would be satisfied. Evelyn, who had organized everything so carefully, who had pressed flowers and written letters and put the right words in the right envelopes and trusted that the future would receive them properly. She would look at this garden, at this house, at those 3 children and their noise, at the man who had learned to say the true thing, and the woman who had learned to hear it, and she would be satisfied that what she'd built had held. Maggie picked up her trowel and went back to work. The larkspur needed dividing. The lavender was spreading past the bed's edge and would need a border set before fall. There was a bare spot near the south fence where something had failed to come back, and she'd been thinking about what to put there, something perennial, something that would spread slowly and establish itself and be there in 10 years without requiring constant attention. She had not decided yet. She had time. The Kansas sky above her was the particular blue of June afternoons, enormous and uncomplicated, the kind of sky that made you understand why people used the word infinite, even when they knew it wasn't accurate, because accurate wasn't always the point. Sometimes the point was simply to look up and take it in. From inside the house, Clara Jane's voice, "Mama." Thomas put a frog in Ruth's boot. Thomas, immediately. It was already in there. Ruth, with the wounded authority of a 4-year-old, it was not. Maggie looked at the sky for one more moment. Then she set down her trowel, brushed the soil from her hands, and went inside to settle the matter of the frog. The garden would be there when she got back. It always was.